Several years ago, when I was about 15 years old, I was online all the time and used an application called Discord to chat with people. Shortly after I started using the application, I met a guy named Esteban. I met him on a video game forum and we kept talking after that. One day he asked me what I looked like physically, and without thinking twice, I sent him a picture of me. He told me I was beautiful, that he liked my long dark hair, and that he loved the way I wore my eye makeup. I thanked him for the compliment, feeling very excited. After about a week, he told me he loved me, and I told him I felt the same way about him. Okay, I know that was fast, but remember, I was 15. Esteban and I had a lot in common, and he was a very handsome guy, and oddly enough, he always wore black, just like me. However, as time went on, this virtual relationship I had with him started to overwhelm me. He always wanted to know where I lived, and I told him that in Texas, but with no further details. Then he said he also lived in Texas and wanted to meet me right away. He stated that he wanted to make our relationship a reality, but I wasn't entirely sure and let him know. We talked every day, and he was the overly clingy type who would text me every minute, which really ended up suffocating you, so I slowly started avoiding him. I didn't want to be direct with him and tell him I didn't want us to talk anymore, but my interactions with him were decreasing, and I say my interactions, because I was the one who started to put some distance, as he didn't stop texting me and being just as intense at any time. Then, one day, my parents went on a trip to celebrate their 20th wedding anniversary, so I was left home alone. I didn't pay much attention to it until night fell. As soon as it started to get dark outside, I felt a little scared, so I closed all the windows, made sure the doors were securely locked, and sat alone in the living room watching TV. The truth is that this was the first time I had been home alone for more than a few hours, and frankly, I felt a little strange and uneasy. But I tried not to make a big deal of it and tried to relax a little in front of the TV. About 20 minutes later, I heard a knock on the window behind me. I realized that I hadn't closed the curtains and thought that maybe the neighborhood kids were playing a joke on me. So I got up and walked over to the window, and the closer I got, the faster my heart beat. But finally I looked outside, and to my relief there was no one there. Seeing no one outside actually made me feel a little calmer, so I closed the blinds, went back to the couch and sat on it, releasing all the air I was holding until that moment. But just then I got a text from Esteban. "See you now," he said. I told him I was busy and couldn't do that, but he said he knew I wasn't busy because he could see me. I started to get scared when I heard him say that. I told him not to say such scary things because I was home alone, and that in itself made me nervous. But he told me that he wasn't kidding, that he could actually see me because he was outside my house and that he knew my parents were out of town. This statement made my stomach sink. I asked him the obvious. How did he know where I lived if I didn't give him my address? And how did he know about my parents? He told me that he had found my exact location through Snapchat so he could see me whenever he wanted to. And as for my parents, it was simple chance, as he had been watching me for the past 2 days before deciding to come see me. This really terrified me. How obsessed do you have to be to research the address of someone who didn't want to give it to you, and incidentally arrive at their house unannounced when this person is all alone? That's not to mention the fact that he admitted to having been spying on me for the past 2 days as if it was anything. I was really surprised and also angry, since last time I told him I still didn't feel ready for us to meet in person. But I was also scared. This guy was clearly not right in the head. Just then I heard a knock on the door and a young man's voice telling me that he was telling me to open it. I recognized the voice immediately, and it was certainly Esteban. Now I didn't know what to do, so I stood there in silence. I was alone, and there was no one to protect me. I texted him trying not to be pushy and told him that I really didn't feel ready for us to meet in person. I reminded him that I had told him that, and also told him that I thought it was very creepy what he was doing. But Esteban called back and said he wouldn't come after driving from another city just to see me. The interesting thing about this is that his tone was never aggressive. I mean, he was talking to me as if everything he was doing was completely normal and casual. He told me that he had gone out of his way to come see me because he was really interested in me and was just planning to surprise me. He told me he was very sorry that things hadn't gone the way he planned and apologized in advance for scaring me. I had no choice but to get up and open the door. He was there, in front of my door, and the truth is that he was tall and handsome, just as he was shown in his pictures. But the truth is that something about him made me uneasy. I don't know if it was his chillingly intense gaze that didn't leave me for a moment or everything he was doing, but I just didn't feel comfortable. Esteban smiled at me and bit his lip as we entered the house. I politely told him to leave a couple of times, but he pretended not to hear me. Esteban sat down on the couch and told me in a cheeky concert that if I wasn't planning to buy him something to drink or eat, this while flashing a smirk and a look that really kept unsettling me. I told him I was sorry for not being so polite, but reminded him that I hadn't invited him to my house, that he had taken the abuse of coming over without telling me anything, and that I wasn't obligated to be hospitable to a guest who invited himself. His cynical smile faded for a moment, but then he picked it up again, got up from the sofa and told me that he would have to go and get himself something, and without another word he headed for the kitchen. I walked behind him telling him that he really had to go, and when he approached the maison and took a drink, I told him I would call the police if he didn't leave immediately. What happened next is something I continue to have nightmares about. Esteban turned to look at me, but he was no longer smiling. On the contrary, the expression on his face was pure anger. His eyes were red and looked like they would pop out of their sockets at any moment. It was then that I noticed that it wasn't just a glass he had taken from the counter. In his other hand was a knife. Esteban pointed the knife at me and told me that it had been too long a trip to leave without first getting what he wanted. I don't think I had known the true meaning of the word terror until that instant. Instinctively, I took a step back and he took a step forward. Now I flashed a smile again, but this time it was much more sinister and laden with evil intent. At that moment, I raised my hands and asked him to put the knife down, but he began to laugh, and at that instant I took advantage of his minimal carelessness to run out the door. He ran after me with the knife in his hand, but fortunately, I was faster. I reached the door in a split second, opened it, and ran out into the street shouting, "Help! This guy wants to kill me, please help me." He chased me up a stretch of the street, but seeing my neighbor started to leave, he immediately started running to his car, which was parked a block up the street. But luckily my next-door neighbor was a policeman, and started running after him with his gun in his hand, ordering him to stop, and seeing that he didn't, he fired 2 shots in the air, causing Esteban to panic and finally stop. Quickly, my neighbor ran over to where he was and ordered him to lie face down with his hands on the back of his head while pointing his gun at him, and there he stayed until the patrol car arrived and finally took him away under arrest. Esteban was 18 years old, so he was tried as an adult and sentenced to several years in prison for attempted murder and harassment. This experience left deep scars in my life, and I can say that I was never the same after that. Even to this day, I have nightmares about that night, and I feel terror just thinking about how close I came to being a victim of a predator. That day seemed like a completely normal workday. "Bye, Michelle, have a nice weekend," our accountant Dakota said to me before getting on the elevator and heading home. "You too, dear," I replied. I packed my things, fixed my hair with a bunch of bobby pins, and got up from my chair. Finally, it was time to go home. By that time, everyone had left, so I sat at the bus stop as I had every day for the past few weeks and waited for the last bus home. It had only been a few weeks since I joined this new advertising agency, so I still can't afford to rent a car, so without having much to do while waiting, I was checking my phone when my eyes went to the other side of the street, and that's when I saw under the light poles a man, apparently a homeless guy. The guy had unkempt hair and dirty, tattered clothes. He was staring at me in a very strange way, but I tried not to make a big deal of it and just ignored him. I pretended he wasn't there and kept scrolling through my newsfeed. A few seconds later, I looked up again. The man was now sitting on the sidewalk in a begging position and smiling at me. He had a big, creepy grin that gave me goosebumps. That's when I suddenly felt a hand on my shoulder. "Hey, Michelle, for crying out loud," I said, jumping up and down in shock as Charlie, my partner, tackled me off guard, "Oh, Charlie, you're still here," I said. "Yeah." I stayed a few more minutes sending emails to get everything in order tomorrow. "What about you? What are you still doing here?" my partner asked. I told him I was just waiting for the last bus to go home, and he kindly offered to give me a ride in his car. However, I knew that Charlie lived quite far from where I lived. It was about a half-hour drive, and I was actually embarrassed to agree to let him drive me, so that I would then have to practically drive across town back to his house. Besides, the bus would be here any minute, and I didn't like people treating me like a damsel in distress. I thanked her for her kindness, but told her I would wait for the bus. "Are you sure? I mean, it won't be any trouble for me." "Relax, I'll be fine. Go home." Charlie stopped insisting. We said our goodbyes, and I watched him walk to the parking lot. Once Charlie left, my eyes went back to the guy across the street, but he wasn't there anymore. I looked for him with my eyes for a few seconds, but he was gone. I let out a big sigh of relief when suddenly I heard a laugh near me. Ha 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 ha. I slowly turned my head to the right, and there he was, standing 10 feet away from me, with rotten teeth and eyes full of malice. Realizing I was looking at him, the man glared at me and licked his lips in a disgusted manner, then started coming towards me. I stood up, feeling very frightened. There was no one around except me and this terrifying stranger. I started walking too. I thought, if I walked away, he would stop following me, but he did not. I started walking forward, leaving the bus stop behind, and then turned around to see if I had lost him, but he was still following me, and his smile widened even more. I started to increase my pace when suddenly I heard footsteps running behind me. I looked back and saw the homeless man running towards me at full speed, reaching out his grubby hands to grab me. At that moment, I lost my patience and started running for my life. "Help! Somebody help me!" I started screaming up and down the street, but there was no one, not a single person nearby. That's when I saw Charlie's car pulling out of the parking lot, and without wasting a second, I ran towards him. Charlie turned the car around and started heading in my direction, but before he could pick up speed, I launched myself onto his hood. Charlie slammed on the brakes and the tires screeched on the pavement. I immediately opened the driver's side door and jumped into his car, panting heavily and my heart racing. "Hey, calm down," Charlie said to me, but I was too upset. Suddenly, the homeless man stepped in front of the car and stopped. He looked at me angrily, as if I were a hunter who had just missed important prey after a good chase. Then he looked at Charlie, cursed him for being there to rescue me, and disappeared into the dark parking lot. "Looks like he was desperate for you. I told you this area isn't safe after dark, Michelle. You should get a car." "I know, but if it's not too much trouble, could you drop me home tonight?" I asked Charlie, feeling a little embarrassed, but my partner's face lit up with glee. "Of course, no problem at all." Charlie started the car with a smile on his face. He seemed excited for some reason, but I wasn't at all. We pulled onto the highway and I rolled down the window to get some fresh air. "Still scared, huh?" my partner said, interrupting my thoughts. "I don't know what would have happened if you had left earlier," I said to Charlie, feeling genuinely grateful to him for getting me out of that terrible situation. "Don't give it another thought. You're safe here now. Here, drink some water. It will do you good." He held out a bottle to me and I drank water as if it was my last day on earth. I hadn't realized how thirsty I was until that moment. I thanked Charlie again for being so kind and attentive to me. He told me it was nothing, and asked if I wanted him to turn on the music, as it would be a long drive. "I'm sure the music will be good," I said. The car radio came on, playing some old 70s song, and I rested my head on the seat to rest a bit. I was determined. For the next 2 days I would just eat, sleep, and drink, without leaving my house. Indeed, without leaving my room, I had had enough for the week, so I couldn't wait to get home. After about 5 minutes, Charlie started talking about his plans for the weekend. "I'm getting a dog tomorrow. I've been planning it for a long time, you know." I told him that was great. He was talking nonstop and I was doing my best to join in the conversation, but suddenly my vision started to blur. "Hey, what's happening to me?" "Why am I feeling so bad?" I asked him, but he didn't say anything. I stared at him with blurred vision and suddenly feeling very tired and sleepy. That's when I remembered the water I had drunk. I asked him what was in the water, but he kept ignoring me and instead turned up the volume of the music and kept talking about everything he would be doing over the weekend. My gaze was fixed on Charlie. As I did my best to keep my eyes open, I asked him again what he had given me, but again he didn't answer my question. He just kept saying, "So, as I was saying, I'm thinking about getting a pit bull. You know they're super smart and they're very food motivated. Isn't that great, Michelle? Do you like dogs? I'm sure they'll like you. Everyone likes you. You're so beautiful." It was only then that he turned to look at me, and then I could see his smile full of mischief, and it's the last thing I remember before I passed out. I woke up in a dimly lit basement, barely able to move my body. It was now obvious that Charlie had drugged me. As I began to regain lucidity, a faint, terrifying growl could be heard from a close distance, but it was too dark to see anything. Suddenly, the lights in the place came on, and the first thing I noticed was Charlie in his pajamas holding a leash in his hand, and as I followed the path of the leash, I encountered a giant-sized pit bull. The creature stuck out its huge, drooling tongue, came up to me, and started licking me. "Good morning, Michelle. Meet Anthony. He's my new friend." Charlie let out a creepy smile and his eyes twinkled. Then for the first time I noticed, he had handcuffed me and tied me to a sewage pipe. "Somebody help me. I'm down here. Please help me." I started screaming like crazy with all my might for help. "Stop screaming. Don't wear yourself out, dear. This is a soundproof space. I did it a week ago, and believe me, even if you had a microphone and 100 speakers, no one would hear you." At that moment, tears rolled down my eyes and I felt a pit open up in my stomach. Charlie bent down to my level and touched my face with his disgusting hand, stroking my cheek almost like a child treats his new toy. "You're so beautiful. No wonder I went crazy for you. What's going on? Where am I? What do you intend to do with me?" I began to ask him loudly. "You are in my house. I brought you here after you got sick last night," the very cynical one told me. Then I started to reproach him that he was the one who drugged me. He started to laugh, saying, "Okay, it's okay, you got me. Maybe the water I gave you in the car had some sleeping pills in it, but I only did it so I could bring you here, that's all." With my eyes full of tears and feeling helpless as ever, I asked him bluntly, "Are you going to abuse me? Is that why you brought me here?" His answer left me more than confused. "Of course not. I can't do that. I never thought of hurting you. Don't think that about me." He started pacing back and forth as he tried to explain himself. "Look, Michelle, all I want is for you to be my girlfriend. I fell in love with you from the day you walked into the office. Remember that red dress you wore? God, it was beautiful and you looked like a goddess. It's a real shame it burned while you were ironing it, and you had to throw it away. How do I know? I watched you for days with my binoculars. I followed you home every night after work and watched you go on with your life from your window. I watched you eating alone, drinking alone, sleeping alone, and that's when I realized that you were just like me, alone." I was wide-eyed and almost couldn't believe what I was hearing. At that moment, Charlie knelt down in front of me, looked me straight in the eyes and said, "We need each other, Michelle. We need each other to complete our lives." After saying those creepy words, Charlie ran to the other side of the room and came back with a shoebox, then opened it and took out some Polaroid pictures. Those were pictures of me taken on normal days. Me taking the bus from the office, opening the door, and even changing my clothes. I was now sure that Charlie was a dangerous man and had been stalking me for a long time. As he showed me the snapshots, he began to explain. "You turned my world upside down, Michelle. Now all I can think about is you, and you're all that matters." He came very close and sniffed my face and hair in a very scary way. I could see the madness in his eyes. I was more terrified now than before. "Just let me go, please," I begged him. "I promise if you let me go home, I'll pretend this never happened. Just let me go, please, I beg you." As I begged Charlie to let me go, he started shaking his head. He looked desperate and suddenly interrupted me and started yelling at me. "Stop saying that, Michelle. Don't say that." But even though he didn't want to listen, I insisted again that I just wanted to go home. That's when his behavior started to get progressively more violent. "Shut up. I'm not going to let you go anywhere, do you understand?" Then he moved closer to me, put his face a few inches from mine, and pressing his index finger against my temple began to say, "You belong to me. Your mind belongs to me. You're mine, Michelle." At that moment, I was completely petrified, beyond terror. He started pacing back and forth again and began to say, "It's going to be all right once you get to know me. You'll like it here, you'll see. Now, who's hungry?" Charlie let go of me and grabbed the dog's leash. At that point, I asked him, was this all planned in advance? Charlie turned around to look at me. His face formed a big smile and he blurted out, "The homeless guy didn't chase you just because I paid him $20 to scare you enough to get you in my car. I didn't mean to force you, you know. I honestly care about you, Michelle. Someday you'll understand. I'll be back with your favorite egg salad sandwich. I love you, Michelle." Charlie left with his giant dog and turned out the lights, leaving me in the dark to suffer. That night I cried until my tears dried up. At the time, no one had the slightest idea that I was being held captive in a madman's basement. God, how did I end up here? I was beginning to give up because my hands were handcuffed to a water pipe and I had no keys. There was no way I could free myself. If only I could get the key, I thought to myself in that moment of desperation, and on the dot I started scratching my head nervously. And that's when I touched the pile of hairpins I still had on. An idea sparked in my head. I pulled out one of the bobby pins with a lot of effort because of the position my hands were tied in, but somehow I said to myself, "It's okay, you can do this." I inserted the tip of the fork into the wife's keyhole, struggled for several minutes straight, but after much effort I heard the click. My heart jumped when I saw the handcuffs come off. I couldn't believe it. I jumped to my feet feeling elated to know I was finally free. I wanted to scream, but this was not the best time. I grabbed a wrench from the shelf in the basement, and even though my heartbeat was racing, I slowly and quietly climbed the stairs. Fortunately, the basement door was open, so I turned the knob as quietly as possible and could hear music coming from the hallway. I figured Charlie must be cooking, having the time of his life knowing he was holding me prisoner in his basement. I peeked out the door trying to locate the pit bull, but I couldn't see him anywhere. The narrow hallway was in front of me, and at the end was the front door of the house. All I had to do now was run for my life to the front door and come out screaming for help. I braced myself for it. 1, 2, 3. I started running at full speed. I ran past the living room and heard the dog bark. Then the pit bull started running after me. But at that point I was running for my life, so nothing was going to stop me, especially now that the front door was inches away. I grabbed the doorknob, turned it, and it opened. But in the next 2 or 3 seconds, a series of events happened simultaneously, which were decisive for the outcome of that night. As I opened the door, I managed to see a truck passing by on the street and immediately shouted for help. At the same time, I started to run towards the street to finally escape from that hell. But as I was about to go through the door, I felt myself being pulled by the hair and fell backwards, crashing to the living room floor again. And then I heard the loud bang of the door closing. "Where do you think you're going?" Charlie lunged at me, covering my mouth with his hands, silencing my screams. He lifted me off the floor and grabbed me from behind, covering my mouth again, and then started dragging me back to the basement. As he did so, I caught sight of a wrench lying on a table at my side. I grabbed it and hit him with it, then ran back out towards the door. But then the huge pit bull blocked my way and started barking at me ferociously. There was no way I could take on that beast on my own, so I just gave up. "Please let me go," I pleaded again with Charlie as he held his bleeding head, but then he reached over and put a knife to my throat. "Keep your voice down or I'll slit your throat right now and no one will know what happened to you, Michelle." My scream died inside my throat, and YouTube no choice but to go back to the basement. However, as we were making our way towards that place of hell, the sound of police sirens began to be heard as they seemed to be approaching down the street. Charlie stopped to pay attention to the sound, and to everyone's surprise, they started blaring loudly just outside the house. He looked at me with angry eyes as if accusing me of having called the police, but the truth is that I didn't. I didn't have my cell phone because he took it from me, so I didn't have any opportunity to do so. As he looked at me with an expression of deep anger, almost as if telling me, "I will kill you for this," I began to shake my head nervously and told him in a very low voice, "I didn't do it." At that precise moment, they started knocking on the door very loudly, and the demanding voice of who was clearly a police officer could be heard on the other side, demanding that they open the door. My first instinct at that moment was to scream, but this man still had a knife held to my throat, and judging by how unhinged he was, I wouldn't be at all surprised if he decided to slit my throat before being apprehended. So I kept quiet. I thought to myself that I would start screaming when he moved away to open the door. However, then I remembered that the basement was soundproofed, and if I went back in there, no matter how much I screamed, the cops wouldn't be able to hear me. With that thought in mind, and at the risk of having my throat slit by this psychopath, I started screaming for help. Then Charlie hit me hard in the head with the handle of the knife, and I collapsed to the floor from the impact. At that moment, Charlie grabbed the dog and started running towards the back door in order to escape through there. Meanwhile, I kept screaming, and that's when I heard the front door being thrown open, and a couple of officers came into the house. But when I pointed towards the back door and told them that Charlie had escaped, I saw him coming back with his hands up and being pointed at by 2 more officers. It appears that the police officers anticipated that he might try to escape out the back, and that is why there were a couple of officers behind the door, and they caught him immediately. That night, Charlie was arrested and was subsequently sentenced to over 15 years in prison for kidnapping, attempted murder, resisting arrest, and a couple of other charges that I can't remember right now. It turned out that the driver of the truck that was passing by on the road when I opened the door trying to escape heard my cry for help and turned towards the house, seeing the exact second when Charlie grabbed me by the hair and dragged me back into the house. So he called the police, told them what he saw, and they immediately sent a posse to the house, thus saving me from a horrible fate. When they found out what happened, no one in the office could believe it. Everyone was in shock, and it was not for less, because Charlie did not seem at all the kind of person who would do something like that. Rather, he was a half-nerd guy who seemed quiet, friendly, and completely normal. But as the saying goes, faces we see, hearts we do not know. And the truth is that sometimes the most evil and sick people are behind the facade of someone harmless. Clearly, this was the case of Charlie. It took me years to pull myself together after living this nightmare. I couldn't help but look behind me whenever I left work or went anywhere. I started to distrust everyone and had a hard time making new friends and finding a partner. But fortunately, I am in a much better place now. However, I can't help but feel a little scared to think that someday that crazy guy will get out of prison and might want to retaliate against me. This happened when I was 16 years old, but it was so shocking to me that even with my bad memory, I remember it very clearly. And honestly, I think this memory will haunt me for the rest of my life. I often used to go for walks in the evenings, either alone or with my neighbor, Laris. However, that night my neighbor could not go for a walk with me. We usually went out around 10 o'clock at night, but I was impatient that night, so I went out about 10 minutes earlier. It was summertime in Phoenix, but I wore my black hoodie anyway. The reason for this was because I was a pretty small girl, even for my age, so I walked around with a knife up my sleeve in case of a problem. There was security in this area, but they were pretty much useless and didn't like kids anyway, so wearing black was to keep the cops patrolling the area from seeing me, and maybe to help keep anyone else from noticing me as well. This was a lower-class suburb, and sometimes crime did its thing around these parts, although it was much safer and quieter now than in the past. The area was heavily wooded and the roads had no street lighting. However, I lived there all my life, so with the moonlight this wasn't really a problem. I could see things as much as they were. I walked to the local park and sat on the swing like I had done a million times before. The park was old and not very well kept, so the swing creaked every time I swung. The wooden picnic tables were half rotten with the paint almost peeling, and the metal slide was covered in rust. There was the main road that ran in front of the park, and a branch of the road ran along the side of the park as well. And it was basically bounded by a thin line of trees between the side road and the park itself. I don't know if you get it, but that's what the place was like. I put on my headphones as I did almost every night, to listen to music while rocking on the swing and enjoying the tranquility and the beauty of the spectacular night scenery that the park offered me. This for me was like a kind of therapy. I don't even know why I liked doing it so much, but I really enjoyed it. After a while, my favorite song came on, and of course I started singing. I loved singing, and I was actually pretty good at it, but I always had stage fright, so that was another one of coming alone to the park at this hour, or with my neighbor, who was my best friend, and there was no one around, so I could sing at the top of my lungs without anyone hearing me and feeling embarrassed. However, that night was different. As I was singing my favorite song, A Toda Garganta, my blood froze when I saw the figure of a person in the middle of the darkness, only about 50 to 100 feet in front of me on the road. The main reason for the chill was the fear of this random person hearing me sing. But then I had a deeper bad feeling, like something was wrong with this person. I noticed it was a man, and he was walking fast, very fast, almost at running speed. I assumed he might have been running away from something or chasing something, but when I looked around everywhere I could see from where I was, I saw nothing and no one but me. Soon this person passed through the park without noticing me, or so it seemed to me, but after a few minutes of waiting to make sure they were gone, I kept singing. After a couple more songs, I decided it was time to go home. As it was after 10:30 and I still hadn't done my walk, my mother was going to be mad at me because I wasn't supposed to be out of the house at such late hours. But I still had that bad feeling in my body, that uncomfortable pit in your stomach that you get when you feel like you're being watched. I even thought I had seen something behind the tree line by the side road and swings, but I dismissed it as an animal or something. Deer were very common in this area, as were dogs and other things, so it was probably just me getting spooked by a harmless animal again. However, no matter how many logical explanations I gave my mind, the feeling that someone was watching me was gnawing at me, so I cut my usual 30-minute, hour-long walk down to only about 15 minutes. So I got up and started to leave the park, turning onto the main road to go home. As I was leaving, I saw a person walking towards the main road, more like running along the park, and it looked like the same person as before. It was clearly a man. He must have been visiting a friend or something, that's what I thought at first. But even if that was the case, I crossed to the opposite side of the road so as not to walk directly past him. This man didn't seem particularly dangerous or strange. I mean, he wasn't a weird, creepy, homeless-looking guy, but I had a bad feeling about him, which is probably what makes him even scarier. As I reached the intersection in front of me, I stopped, walked past him and looked at the man, taking in as much detail as I could in the moonlight coming in between the tree branches. He looked normal, was probably of average height, wore a pure white baseball cap with no logos casting a shadow over his face, and a pure white polo-type shirt. There wasn't a speck of dirt on the man. He looked well-groomed and made the moonlight almost shine on him like he was some sort of ghost, which only added to my uneasy feeling that he clearly wasn't there to be working out or anything. The man watched me as I walked by, and I tried to pretend I didn't notice. Every once in a while I would look around as if I was just looking at the forest so I could see the man outside of my peripheral vision. I didn't want or need to see this guy in detail, partly because I was afraid of the possibility of seeing something else. Just because the man was much bigger than me didn't mean he probably wasn't armed as well. Once I was about 15 feet beyond the intersection, I did one of these and my stomach dropped when I saw him turn around and start following me. Maybe he was just going for an extra long walk or something, probably not following me. At that moment, another thought popped into my mind and made me stand up. I had been there for probably 15 minutes or so, singing after he showed up. What if he wasn't visiting anyone? What if he was the thing I saw just beyond the tree line? That's kind of obvious now, which was almost definitely the case, but let's be fair. When do 16-year-olds think about all the details of a situation during the situation? He was probably watching me the whole time. He could have slipped away and done God knows what at any time. I kept doing my peeks and noticed that he was getting closer and closer. At that moment, I gripped my knife tightly, ready in case I had to use it. The chance of it coming out right wasn't the greatest, but it was a better chance than not trying at all. However, I wanted that to be a last option. I tried to make sure it wasn't obvious that I was keeping an eye on him, I didn't want him to get anxious and decide to accelerate whatever plan it was. I was only halfway home, and this was before I had surgery on a bad ankle, so I was absolutely sure he could catch me before I even got close if I started running. So that wasn't an option at all. I definitely didn't have many options at that point, so the one I chose was to bide my time for an opportunity to open up. I kept walking at a fairly fast pace, but not panicking, keeping an eye on the man as he approached, and was very aware of what he was doing and any chance he had to escape. And then this one came. I saw a pair of headlights shining on the street and felt that this one was sent by God himself. A car was rolling toward me at a careful pace as usual, considering the animals I mentioned earlier. It was Jem's dad. I recognized the shape of the lights, and as the car got closer, I became convinced it was him. I was never so relieved to see that little white car. I tried to flag him down without him knowing I was in trouble, but he just passed. He must have thought I was just waving. I looked back again, though he didn't stop. He did exactly what I needed. He slowed down a little as he passed. The man backed up a lot and crossed to the other side of the road. Then the headlights were on him, and he couldn't see me. At least for about 5 or 6 seconds, maybe a little longer, even readjusting to the darkness. I walked faster. I didn't run. That way my footsteps wouldn't be too noisy. But I turned the corner before his eyesight could readjust again to the darkness and see me again. Once I was able to turn around and no longer saw him, I ran home and locked the door. I knew better than to leave it unlocked, since after all I lived in the woods. Just because I could no longer see him didn't mean he wasn't around. Being at home, I texted Jem, asked her to meet me outside right now because something happened and I needed her to come over. She said she was fine, and we both headed out. As soon as I saw her in the driveway, I ran over to her house. I didn't want to be outside any longer than I had to be. She was panicking and asking what had happened and what was wrong, so once I caught my breath, I told her everything. Just after I finished explaining, Jem's dad came into the house and, looking worried, then noticed me hiding behind her, and that's when he made a relieved gesture. He told me he was about to go to my house to make sure I was okay, so I asked him if he saw the man following me, and he answered yes, but he said he didn't really see his face, but he did notice that he was trying to make it look like he was talking on the phone, when in fact he wasn't holding anything in his hand. But that didn't even come close to the worst part. Jem's dad looked very scared, and this was the first time I had seen this man like that. But then I understood the reason. He told us that the man was not alone. Up ahead, I saw a vehicle that was parked to the side with the lights off, and one of the doors was open. There was another man there, very much like the one that was following me, and he seemed to be waiting for him. Then when the boy lost sight of me thanks to being dazzled by the lights of Jane's father's car, he began to look in all directions and made a gesture of frustration, and then headed towards that car where his companion was. He seemed to make a gesture of complaint, and then they both got in and started off. When I heard Jem's father say this, I froze completely, as I had never noticed the presence of this car at any time. I have no idea what the intentions of this couple of guys were with me, but I am almost completely sure that their intention was to kidnap me to do who knows what creepy thing. I am very thankful that I got out of that situation unscathed, and from that day on I never went to the park at night again, let alone alone. When I was still a senior in high school, my mother and I used to go to the movies almost every weekend. This was a regular mother-daughter bonding ritual. We used to watch a movie, review it, and then go to dinner at the Burger King next door. We would always pick up something for my dad too, a takeout box. That day was a Friday like any other, and we had already gone to the movies, had our food, and now drove home like we always did. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but the next morning I woke up to a Facebook friend request from a name I didn't recognize. Thinking it might have been a suggestion from a mutual friend, I simply accepted. But then about 5 minutes later, I get a message from the same account that goes something like, "Hey, I know this might sound a little weird, but I saw you at Burger King last night and was wondering if you'd like to go out sometime." Reading this, I was like, huh, if this is someone who only saw me at a fast food restaurant, how did he find out my name? Could it be that he heard my mom say it or something? He was polite, but it still freaked me out. To have found me, I must have been looking for hours. I immediately saw all these red flags, so I had no intention of accepting his invitation, but at the same time I didn't want to be a jerk to him, so I messaged him back as, "Hi. Yes, I was there, but I'm actually seeing someone right now and I don't think I'm very interested in dating anyone else." At first, her response was encouraging and she seemed to take it well. She said something like, "Ah, that's too bad. I'm sorry if this is awkward." Now I reply, "No, don't worry. You didn't know. I hope you have a great your weekend." Now it was a closed response, the kind that's designed to end the conversation. But when I closed it this way, there was a very subtle shift in her tone, not aggressive, but a little demanding. "I just thought since I went to all this effort to find you, you could at least give me a chance to get to know me." I literally had no idea how this guy had found me, and I didn't like the idea that anyone could look me up online, no matter how innocent their intentions, so I asked him directly, "How did you find me?" He starts typing and then stops typing and then stops, and I can tell he's thinking about the right way to phrase it. Then he says something like, "Where there's a will, there are ways. I can find anyone online. It's easy when I set my mind to something, I achieve it. Tell me, is your current boyfriend an achiever like that?" I distinctly remember him using that overachiever type term, and honestly, it was so embarrassing for him to say that if I wasn't discouraged before, I certainly was now. But still, I wanted to find out how this creep had managed to track me down, so I did something stupid to get him to tell me. I wrote him, "Honestly, I didn't. And it's kind of cool that you're so smart. How did you do it? How did you find me?" He wrote back, "I was the one who slipped your mom's card." Okay, he wasn't a hacker, he just worked at Burger King, so yeah, he had probably heard my name, then matched it to the name on my mom's card, and then, bingo, he finds me on Facebook. I confess I had to restrain myself from letting out a laugh, because if he was already that psycho, then I thought I'd better not turn him crazy. So I said, "Ah, clever. I like him, but like I said, I'm seeing someone at the moment, so thanks, but no thanks, bye." I followed up by muting the conversation, but I didn't block the guy or remove him from the friends list or anything like that, thinking I might be making him angry. I was a little worried, but then I just went on with the rest of my day. Yes, I told all my friends what happened and how creepy this guy was, and casually suggested to my mom that we pick a new food place for our dinners after the movie. But other than that, I just went about my day as usual. That day, after doing everything normal, I simply went to sleep, unaware that I had an insane person on my Facebook friends list. It wasn't until later that night, when I opened the messenger on my phone, that I saw the small tally of notifications, 67 in total, followed by his name. I realized that he had sent me other messages, and yes, it said 67. He had sent 67 different messages, and he had been sending them intermittently all day. But it wasn't until I read what they said that I started to freak out. I'm not going to write down everything I remember in detail, but I'm pretty sure many of you will be able to guess most of them. Think nice guy style humiliation, along with threats of actual violence. Basically, he said that if he had managed to track me down online in a few hours, imagine what he could find out by the end of the week. He said that he had friends who would help him break into my house, that after that they would tie up my parents, kill them in front of me, and then take turns abusing me until I died. And I must say, this is the clean, uncensored version of everything this sicko wrote to me in those 67 messages he sent me. Think about that, and if you think it can't get any creepier, the final message I read before I ran downstairs to tell my mom and dad went like this: "I'm in my car and I'm on my way to your house." I didn't know if he was just trying to scare me, but I was crying in panic while Dad called the police. The guy ended up getting arrested for the threats he made, and I know he got fired from Burger King because my mom made sure his bosses knew what he had done. The police arrested him, and he had to go to jail for a few months. They put a restraining order on him, and since then, I never saw the guy again. so I think this was one of those cases where his bark was louder than his bite. But I know there are other women out there who are not so lucky, and their stalkers are much more willing to approach and do them real harm. I just hope that someday we can live in a world where men don't act predatory and creepy towards women they like, something that is completely counterintuitive to what we want in a man. I wish they understood, but until then, I guess all we can do is try to be safer online and be very careful, especially with dating apps. I really hope I never have to run into another idiot like that again, who won't take no or no for an answer. My name is Augusto and I am currently a filmmaker, something I am truly passionate about and for which I worked very hard. But before dedicating myself to my great passion, I had several odd jobs to be able to pay my bills and make ends meet. One of them was in a cleaning company. Basically, we would go to different businesses in the city, mostly offices and malls, and give them a good cleaning hand to get them ready for a new day. I remember the pay was pretty decent and the crew I was with was very nice. We were all good friends and colleagues, but we didn't always do the job together. Sometimes we were a team, sometimes I went alone. We also worked in rotating shifts, because the company not only worked during the day, in fact, a large part of our customers required night work. These were mostly office buildings and stores, as these most of the day were in work. So it was not feasible to do cleaning in daylight hours. And the experience that I am going to tell you today happened to me just one day when I had to work alone and in the night shift. This was an office building where I was often sent. I had to work late that day and I really liked the night shifts. There was no traffic to and from work and I could do my work quietly without interruption, and once I was done I could just leave without any hassle. It's not something I would have wanted to do forever, obviously, but for a while it was fine and I actually liked it, especially since it wasn't exactly a very demanding job, either physically or mentally, and it paid the bills. But moving on with the story, the building was not huge, but it had 3 floors, and when I arrived I was basically the only living being in the whole place. The routine was simple. I had a to-do list: vacuuming, cleaning the bathrooms, disinfecting some areas, in total about 2 hours of work. That day, as always, when it was my turn in this building, I was given the keys, and when I arrived I found all the lights off. I started on the 2nd floor, doing my routine tasks, and after finishing I went up to the 2nd floor. I had been on the 2nd floor for about 20 minutes, vacuuming, when I thought I heard the sound of the elevator. I stopped the vacuum cleaner for a moment to listen better, and indeed the elevator was moving, going up to the 3rd floor. This puzzled me a bit because I was sure there must not be anyone else in the building besides me. What would anyone be doing there at that hour? If there was supposed to be someone, I would have been told. I didn't want to give it too much thought and went on with the cleaning, forgetting a bit about it. When I finished vacuuming, started with the bathrooms and went outside to clean a window in one of the offices, I heard a noise upstairs. My heart raced instantly and I tried to calm down, but I couldn't. I didn't know where the noise was coming from. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, but I couldn't stop thinking about those noises I was hearing and kept cleaning. But every creaking sound made my hair stand on end. In the end, curiosity won out over fear. I decided to go and see what was going on. I walked towards the place where the noises were coming from. At first I saw nothing, but suddenly the noise came again, louder and closer than before. A man ran out from behind a wall and into the stairwell. I saw him for just a few seconds, but I couldn't get a good look at his face, yet I had the distinct feeling that this person shouldn't be there. How had he gotten in? I had no idea. For an instant I thought it was some worker who had to work overtime or something, but this person seemed to be hiding, and that really started to scare me. I approached the ladder and opened the door carefully. After all, I didn't know who this guy was, or if he was armed, so better to act cautiously. But when I opened the door, absolute silence. Nothing could be heard. I looked inside trying to see the man, but no one was there. The guy must have been running up or down the stairs at full speed because I didn't think he would have had time to get to another floor, but even so, I had a feeling he was still in there. "Who's in there?" I shouted, but there was no response. Then I shouted again, saying that no one was supposed to be in the building and to leave immediately or I would call the police. Right after I said that, I heard a door open and slam shut on the second floor. Although the man didn't answer me, I assumed he was leaving, which confirmed to me that he was an intruder, and surely upon hearing the phrase, "I'll call the police," he got spooked. I decided to wait a little longer in the stairwell, and after a couple of minutes, I decided to go back to the second floor and continue with my work. It didn't take me too long to finish there. Then I went up to the third floor to clean that level. I went through the same routine as normal as I had done for the previous 2 floors. Everything was quiet. I was going to have to report that someone had been in the building, but I really thought the man had left. Just as I was about to finish with the third floor, I was in one of the corridors when suddenly I heard footsteps. They were coming up behind me. I had absolutely no idea how the man was here, but of course it was him. The footsteps behind me were approaching rapidly, and when they were maybe 20 feet behind me, I turned around and then panic set in. The man was running in my direction with a metal bar in his hand, and clearly his intentions were not friendly. At that moment, adrenaline shot through my body. I started to run and scream for help, but I knew it was very unlikely that anyone could hear me. This was a business area, and hardly anyone would be around at this hour. I ran toward the stairs at full speed, knowing that I had no chance of making it to the elevator, and if this guy caught up with me, I was a dead man. When I got to the stairs, I ran down as fast as I could. I heard the man running down the stairs behind me, and he was now quite close. I turned in an instant to see how close he was and realized that the man was now hot on my heels. Even though I only saw him for a couple of seconds, I was able to detail him the best. The guy had long, sticky hair and a bushy, unkempt beard. Also, his clothes were worn and torn, so I deduced that he was homeless. I continued running down the stairs with my heart drumming in my ears and adrenaline overflowing my veins. I'm not exactly an athletic man, never have been, but with my life on the line, there was no way I was going to let this guy shoot me to death. When I finally got to the second floor and saw the front door, it was like seeing the very gates of heaven. I went through it like a bullet and didn't stop until I got to my car, jumped in, started it up, and immediately went in reverse with a loud screech of tires. Then I could see the guy standing in front of the building with the big metal bar in his hand, but a couple of seconds later he threw it aside and ran out the back of the building. Although this time I was sure the guy was gone, there was no way he was going back into the building. I drove to the 24-hour store a few blocks away, parked there, and called the police, notifying them of what had just happened. They arrived a few minutes later and I drove them to the building. They searched all over the place, but as expected, they found no one. The guy had already disappeared. That same night I notified my superiors what had happened, and they notified the owners of the building. Fortunately, this incident did not happen again, and I did not have to go back, because by the time this madman began to chase me with what I now know was a large metal pipe, as it was lying in the entrance when I arrived with the police, I had practically finished my work. This was a very frightening experience. However, I continued to work at the company for another year, but I never wanted to go back to that building. I still dread to think what would have happened if I hadn't realized that this guy was coming after me, or if he had managed to catch me. I worked in a nursing home for over 5 years. I really loved working there. It was stressful at times and I really hated changing bedpans, but for the most part my job was pretty fun. I had a really nice relationship with the elderly, especially the old ladies. Here they called me Rojito because I have red hair, and most of them treated me like I was their grandson, so you can imagine how they spoiled me. Unfortunately, the center was understaffed, as not everyone likes this kind of work, and because of budget issues the salaries were not the best either. For this reason, I had to work the night shift 3 days a week as well. I hated the night shift more than anything else. I would rather shift 100 beds than have to spend all night in that place. But this had nothing to do with the elderly or the work, but with the fact that they kept all the lights off, except for a single lamp at the front desk, and all I had to do was sit there all night, check the rooms every hour, and call an ambulance if there was a medical emergency. It might not seem so bad, other than the sheer boredom of it all, but you don't know how creepy this place was in the dark. I mean, I'm a brave guy, I take care of myself and all, but when I was in the nursing home after hours and in that gloom, I felt like I was 6 years old again. The building was over 100 years old, so it was constantly creaking and settling. And because we were surrounded by a wooded area, I would always see silhouettes of animals walking outside through the windows. They were always out there, slithering in the dark. Despite my nerves, I never really had a problem during the night shift until one fall day when I was about 3 years old working there. It was Friday then, and I was called in at the last minute because my coworker Edgard had just been fired for stealing meds. Things were normal at first. All the residents had taken their meds and gone to bed. I was at the front desk, checking my phone, when suddenly I heard a door slam. This startled me, so I ran to see what was going on. That's when I saw Vilma, one of our residents, standing in the hallway and looking somewhere. She was trembling and her eyes were wide open. I approached her slowly, afraid that she might hurt herself, asked her what was wrong, and she mumbled, "He's outside. He's behind us." If this had happened during the day, I would have assumed that Vilma was just having some episode related to senile dementia. But this was the night shift, and hearing those words obviously made my heart start pounding in my chest. Both his words and his expression were very frightening, and I really didn't know quite how to act. But I tried to calm myself down and said, "Wait here." As I slowly walked into his room and looked out the window. A clump of trees was just outside. I looked for a few seconds and saw nothing. But suddenly I jumped back as I noticed a figure running into the shadows. That didn't look like an animal. It looked like a person, a man. I quickly closed the latch on the window and then ran back into the hallway. "Okay, I think I saw it," I said to Vilma. "Wait here, okay? I'm going to call the police." I started to head toward the front desk, but she grabbed the back of my shirt and pulled me back. Vilma had never done anything like that before. She was a somewhat eccentric old lady, but she was not violent. "Vilma," I said, "let me get the phone." I looked straight into her face and saw that somehow she looked different from how she looked just a minute before, as if something had changed inside her. With surprising strength, she grabbed my shoulders and spun me around. Before I could do anything, I tried to gently push her away, but she wouldn't stop. I had to push her back, and in doing so, she just laughed like a lunatic. At that moment, I didn't know what to think. Maybe she was indeed having a small psychotic break, an episode of senile dementia, but this was the first time she was displaying behavior like that. I turned and ran down the hallway to call the police, but then more doors opened around me. Angelica, Luciana, and Linda stumbled out of their rooms. They were all dressed in pajamas like Vilma, but their eyes were wide and unhinged. I didn't understand what was going on. It was as if something had driven them all crazy. Linda grabbed my arm tightly. Then I tried to move forward, but Angelica stood in front of me, blocking my way. "Look, it's Rohito," she shouted. Suddenly more doors opened and more old women came out. Then I realized something was really wrong. What had happened to all of them? I tried to go around Angelica, but she kept blocking my way like a soccer player, who was a very large woman and who had always been kind to me, put her arms around me and started caressing me in a strange way, being, "What are you doing, Rohito? Where are you going?" You know, my husband had red hair too. Then he winked at me, like flirting with me. What the hell was going on? I immediately tried to shove her off me by pushing her against the wall and ran back down the hallway, finally managing to get around Angelica and move toward the front desk. It seemed like all the residents were awake now, and more than half the night. They were all stumbling toward each other and toward me. The whole building was filled with their unhinged laughter, and I had no idea what had happened to them. It didn't make sense. It was as if a macabre aura had filled the place and possessed all the elders. Within seconds, I reached the front desk and grabbed my phone. With trembling fingers, I unlocked the screen and called 911. As it rang, I looked around and noticed that more and more seniors kept coming out of their rooms acting just as strange. But at that moment, I also noticed that the door to our medicine cabinet was wide open. Someone else was here. "Hello?" A police dispatcher answered. I told him to send as many people as he could. He asked me about the nature of the emergency, but I didn't know how to explain. None of it made any sense. "There's been an attack," I finally said, and hung up the phone. As the old people continued to laugh, others talking to themselves and others just wandering around. That's when I headed for the medicine cabinet. Whoever was there, maybe they could explain what was going on. As I walked in, I didn't see anyone right away, but I could hear someone inside rummaging through the shelves. "Hello," I said. "Who was in the cabinet?" I asked the dispatcher. The place froze. Then I could see his outline, but he wasn't moving. And then, slowly, he stepped into the light. "Edgard," I whispered. Edgar was dressed in the uniform that of the compound and had traces of dried leaves stuck to his clothes, which suggested to me he must have slipped inside from outside from the forest. He was the figure Vilva saw earlier. He looked at me angrily, and I became alert. "You took it all," he said in a complaining tone. "What do you mean, everything?" I asked, confused. "My personal stash. You took it." "What did you do?" he said as he held up an empty pill bottle. "That's not yours. That's the muscle relaxant he's today to the elderly to make them sleep peacefully." "Edgard," I said slowly, "what are you doing here?" "You got fired." "Yes," he said, "for changing prescriptions. But it wasn't my fault. I just needed to make a little extra money. Plus there were tons of these jars in there. Why did you use precisely mine? You wasted my entire stash. I don't know what the hell was in those vials, but he sure had gotten some in there too. This man was completely crazy. How was I supposed to know that he had slipped God knows what into the old people's pills? But now I was worried about something more important, and that was that I didn't know what the heck it was that I gave them and what effects it might have on the residents. This thought came into my head almost premonitory, for at that very moment I began to hear screams in the hallway. I immediately ran out to the place with Edgard behind me. My nightmare came true. Martin, an elderly diabetic with hypertension problems, was convulsing on the floor. I immediately rushed over to him to prevent him from hurting himself more seriously and saving himself with his own fluids. While holding Martin, I started yelling to Edgar, who was standing like a statue behind me, what the hell was in the vials. But he didn't answer me. Instead, he ran off to the medicine cabinet and then came back with a vial of something and a syringe. Obviously, I asked him what it was, but he didn't tell me either. He just pushed me away and started putting the medicine into Martin. After that, almost immediately, the old man stopped convulsing and started to react. But then it was Vilma's turn. She also fell to the floor with a convulsion, and then 2 more elders. I started to panic, knowing how dangerous this was and that there could probably be a chain reaction due to the I don't know what in the pills. At that point, Edgard handed me the bottle and told me to look in the pantry and get more syringes. So I did, and we began to assist all the elderly who had this reaction. But when we were at it, police sirens started to be heard. Then Edgard looked at me with a mixture of surprise and hatred. "You called the police, you son of a... What the hell did you want me to do?" All the old people were acting like lunatics and had no idea what was going on. Was it me who drugged them? At that moment, Edgard threw down the vial and syringe he was holding and ran out the door trying to escape, but he couldn't even get there because the cops immediately came in and ordered him to put his hands up. One policeman grabbed Dan and handcuffed him. The other officers approached and helped control the crowd of drugged elderly people in the hallway. Finally, the ambulance arrived and the paramedics helped me administer injections with the medication that appeared to be the antidote to counteract the effects of the drug in the pills. Fortunately, there were no fatalities, but from what the paramedics told me, it was really lucky that we had this medicine on hand and used it in time. Edgard, of course, was arrested and jailed, and narrowly escaped a long sentence for manslaughter. When I look back, I think that's just what he thought of when Martin started convulsing, and that's why he wanted to help and keep him from dying, just like the others, because I doubt very much that he did it as a good Samaritan. Fortunately, that was the only unfortunate incident that happened while I was working there, except for the death of one of our grandparents, which is very sad, but something that you end up adapting to when you work in an elderly care place. All this happened when I was about 3 years old working in this place, and I continued working there for 2 more years. But then I was offered a better paying job in another city, and I decided to quit, although it was not easy, because I really got very fond of these grandparents. On my last day, the elders gave me a beautiful farewell, where they thanked me for taking care of them and treating them so well, and then that episode came up. Fortunately, this time we laughed about it, but I knew that it could have ended very badly. Finally, the ambulance arrived and the paramedics helped me administer injections with the medication that appeared to be the antidote to counteract the effects of the drug in the pills. Fortunately, there were no fatalities, but from what the paramedics told me, it was really lucky that we had this medicine on hand and used it in time. Edgard, of course, was arrested and jailed and narrowly escaped a long sentence for manslaughter. When I look back, I think that's just what he thought of when Martin started convulsing, and that's why he wanted to help and keep him from dying, just like the others. Because I doubt very much that he did it as a good Samaritan. Fortunately, that was the only unfortunate incident that happened while I was working there, except for the death of one of our grandparents, which is very sad, but something that you end up adapting to when you work in an elderly care place. All this happened when I was about 3 years old working in this place, and I continued working there for 2 more years. But then I was offered a better paying job in another city and I decided to quit, although it was not easy, because I really got very fond of these grandparents. On my last day, the elders gave me a beautiful farewell, where they thanked me for taking care of them and treating them so well. And then that episode came up. Fortunately, this time we laughed about it, but I knew that it could have ended very badly. I was working in a liquor store inside a gas station while I was in college. Since I had classes during the day, I logically opted for the night shift. It was a little demanding, but the youth helped. For a long time, there was only one person working at night, and many female colleagues complained about the lack of cameras and that at those hours, every character came in. In fact, one night before I started working there, a woman came in to buy groceries, and when she went out to her car, a man assaulted her at gunpoint. She gave him the money, and luckily the guy let her go. The woman returned to the store crying hysterically, and although the police arrived right away, they never found the assailant. Personally, I preferred to work with someone else even if there were no security issues. The night was much shorter when there was someone to chat with, and the girl I used to close with got along with me very well. In total, there were 4 of us doing the night shift: Oscar, Nico, Diana, and me. Diana had another job and only came in a couple of nights a week to lend a hand to one of the managers. Oscar and I worked together about 3 nights a week, and Nico would join one of us another 2 nights. Diana was a super nice girl and a lot of fun, but she didn't like the work very much. Oscar always got mad at her because she stayed at the cash register while he did everything, but since she only came 1 night a week, we didn't think much of it. Nico, on the other hand, was a case apart. He worked there 5 days a week, like Oscar and me, but he was never put with more than 1 person at a time. Nobody seemed to like working with him because Nico was a bit peculiar. One of those people who tell you their whole life as soon as they meet you, spilling a lot of personal details that make you feel uncomfortable. He always complained about the problems in his marriage, apparently. He had had some pretty serious problems with alcohol and drugs, and although he had managed to change drugs for weed, he still didn't control his drinking, and that was very evident. He was also a bit of a pain in the ass, but I guess you get used to all kinds of people in these kinds of jobs. I had been on the job for about 5 months when Nico's stories started to get more intense. All of a sudden, he started telling people that he had been diagnosed with schizophrenia when he was young and had to take a lot of pills to keep from becoming violent. Not exactly what you want to hear from someone you're working with alone in the middle of the night. But hey, everyone has their problems, and sometimes people with mental illness suffer a lot of stigma. I myself have struggled with anxiety and depression, and without medication, well, it's not like I'd be killing anyone, but I'd be in a hospital all the time for sure. So, even though I was a little bit shaky, I tried to reassure him that a lot of people need medication for different problems, and that as long as you take it and are honest with the doctors, there's no reason why you can't do the same as any other ordinary person. When I told him that, he seemed satisfied with my answer, and soon after, the conversation drifted to other topics. For the next week, Nico was especially friendly and kind to me, reminding me daily that he was taking his medication and feeling much better. I responded enthusiastically, but I'm sure everyone, especially Oscar, could tell that I wished he would stop talking to me about it and leave me alone. Oscar had a wife and 2 daughters, ages 12 and 8, so he couldn't help but see us younger girls as his own daughters and think about what they might have to face someday. He also seemed to go out of his way to cut off my conversations with Nico quickly, which I greatly appreciated. Oscar made no effort to hide the fact that he didn't like Nico, and boy, did he have reason to. Nico was getting closer and closer to me, even though this was not something I exactly wanted. But for some reason, he felt too comfortable around me, and when I say too much, I mean too much. It wasn't long before he started telling me details about why he had been diagnosed with schizophrenia, rather than how he was doing on medication. I won't go into detail, because many of those stories were very violent and sexual in content. This obviously made me even more uncomfortable, especially because of the disturbing details. I told him repeatedly that I didn't want to know about those topics, and he acted like he understood, but an hour later, he would bring it up again. When I told Diana about it, she said she would take care of it, and later she talked to her friend, the same manager who had asked her to work there. The manager said there wasn't much she could do, as it seemed I was the only one Nico talked to about such things. The situation was becoming increasingly tense for all of us who worked with him. After the manager spoke with Nico, 2 other co-workers who had worked with him on the night shift also reported inappropriate comments he had made to them. When questioned, I confirmed that my co-workers' statements were very similar to things he had said to me, and after that, Nico received a final warning and was sent home. The next 2 times I saw him, he went on a rant about how the people who had reported him were only doing it because they didn't like him. I assumed he didn't know that I had been interrogated too, and neither Oscar nor I had any intention of telling him. Honestly, we were scared of him, and not for nothing, because this guy was extremely unstable. At one point, he got so angry that he almost started crying, saying that those people were lucky that he was taking his medication, and that if he wasn't, I had no idea what he would do to them. At the time, we didn't take the threat too seriously, and luckily that was the end of it. But as soon as he clocked out, Oscar told him that we had a lot of work that night, and we didn't have time to chat. Nico nodded and left without another word. Oscar wasn't lying. The delivery truck had arrived very late that day, so there was still a lot of stuff to put on the shelves. One thing that previous shifts never seemed to do, unless absolutely necessary, was restock the beverage coolers. It was true that it was easier to do it at night when there were fewer customers, but it was a total pain in the ass because we couldn't stop and chat. But hey, it was part of the adventure, as we used to say jokingly, so we got on with it. I don't remember exactly when Oscar went to refill the drinks, but it must have been quite late, because we had already been working for quite a while. At that point, I was concentrating on restocking the shelves, making sure everything was full. Suddenly, the doorbell rang, indicating that someone had entered the store. "Good evening," I greeted cordially, as I always did when a customer arrived, saying that I was on my way. Normally, at that hour, people just came in for cigarettes or to pay for gas, so I put down my box of goods and headed for the cash registers. He couldn't get through the hole, but he was able to reach the doorknob and open the door from the inside. According to what Oscar told me, because I was on the other side talking to the operator, Nico approached the door, stuck his face to the hole he had just made, and said something that still makes me cry when I remember it. In that same sing-songy, disgusting voice he had used before, he cheerfully said, "I'll cut them into little pieces so small you'll never find them." As harsh as he wanted to sound, Oscar was as scared as I was. He was older than Nico, about 38 years old, but thin and not exactly known for his fighting skills. Still, as soon as Nico opened the door, he lunged at him with his whole body, knocking him back from the impact. Oscar yelled at me to run, and even though I felt like my legs were going to give out on me at any moment, I ran after him towards the back doors of the store. Nico was cursing and yelling at us as we ran, and we were so scared. Oscar crashed hard into the back door, cursing in pain as he realized it wouldn't open. We later found out that Nico had pushed the dumpster against the door, blocking it completely before entering the store. The bastard had it all planned. We both realized at the same time that Nico had planned all this to kill us. He rounded the corner, still walking with those clumsy steps, though faster now, and that gave me some time to slam the backroom door shut and bar it. I sat down in front of the door with Oscar bringing everything he could find to lock it. Nico must have heard my desperate cry because he started screaming my name, saying that I wasn't the one he wanted, that he would make sure I died before I felt any pain if I opened the door for him. Then he started stabbing at the door with the knife and yelling at me to open it. I started screaming in desperation and pulled away when I saw the knife go through the door for the first time, but Oscar and I struggled to hold it shut. I remember we looked into each other's eyes. We were both crying, and I wanted to say something to comfort him, but the words wouldn't come out. I was terrified too. I had dropped my phone when I ran to close the door, and neither of us could move to get it. We had no idea how long it would take for the police to arrive. The door was wooden, so it wouldn't take much more of Nico's banging and ramming, and if the knife went through the door and hit one of us, all I could think about was that if I was going to die that night, my dog would never know why I didn't come home. I would never graduate or have enough money to start enjoying life. All the future plans my boyfriend and I had made would never come true. It would be the most anticlimactic and horrible ending of all. Suddenly, everything was silent. There were no police sirens, no screams, nothing. It was as if Nico had disappeared. Oscar and I looked at each other, not daring to breathe, trying to listen for any sign of life on the other side of the door. We both turned away from the door when we heard a gunshot, then another, and a third. More silence. Finally, a voice asked, "Is anyone here?" We weren't sure if we should answer, but the voice continued, "My name is Ernest. I'm a policeman. I'm off duty, but I've been listening to the radio. Are you all right?" Oscar got up and moved everything blocking the door out of the way. He opened it just enough to poke his head in and seemed to be out of breath. He opened the door all the way and I ran out into the store. I grabbed my phone and saw that the call had been cut off, or the operator had hung up. When I went back to the back room where Oscar and our rescuer were, he was explaining that the police were sending several cars, but they were all far away, and he had a bad feeling they wouldn't get there in time. The operator had told them what they would find when they arrived. The police officer didn't want any of us to leave until the patrol car arrived, because even though Nico had been shot in the arm, he still had the knife when it was taken away. The officer said he would have chased him, but with the state the store was in, he feared someone was hurt or dying inside, so he preferred to come to our aid. God bless this man. The next 30 minutes were a blur. Oscar and I were sitting on the floor, hugging each other, when the police finally arrived. Ernest had called dispatch and informed them of the new situation, so most of the patrol cars coming toward us were diverted to look for Nico. Soon after, Oscar used his phone to call his wife. She arrived promptly, and he completely broke down as he hugged his wife. I had a similar reaction when I got home and saw my dogs wagging their tails, excited to see me. Nico was found about 2 weeks later in an old trailer I had in the woods. The reason he attacked us was because he thought Oscar wanted him gone so fast, so he could call the owner and get him fired. What we didn't know was that his wife had kicked him out of the house a few days before all this, and was filing a restraining order against him because of the threatening messages and calls he had been receiving. Nico told the police that his job was the only thing he had left and that Oscar should be punished for trying to take it away from him. He said I wasn't the target, and that he didn't want to kill me. But he knew he had a better chance of killing Oscar with me there, since he would protect me. Neither Oscar nor I called the owner or any manager about Nico's comments that night, although perhaps we should have. In retrospect, what he said was really disturbing, but we were so used to him being a loudmouth and saying horrible things all the time that we didn't realize he could get serious about hurting someone. I had known him for 5 months because he was already at work when I arrived, and Oscar had known him for a year, and he had never done anything violent. We all thought it was just talk. We also trusted that all employees had passed a background check before being hired. Nico cut a deal with the prosecution. They dropped the 2 attempted murder charges, and in exchange, He would go to a psychiatric hospital for offenders. Neither Oscar nor I were happy with this verdict, but we had to accept it. However, a few months later, I started receiving threatening messages from an unknown number, and the same thing happened to Oscar. We notified the authorities and they agreed to investigate, but no one did anything. In the end, both Oscar and I quit our jobs. I moved to another city and started over there, while Oscar also moved with his family to a rural area where he bought a small country house, both of us hoping that this madman would never find us. But we still live with that latent fear. I never knew anything more about Nico, nor do I want to know. But recently one of our ex-partners told me that Nico had completed his rehabilitation and had been released. This is something I haven't been able to corroborate yet, but I'm terrified just thinking that he's out there and could find us at some point. Working nights at the mall as a cleaner wasn't exactly my ideal job, but at least it paid the bills. We were a small team, just 3 of us. Me, Marta, the boss, a woman in her 40s, and Carlos, a nice guy a few years older than me, who was always telling jokes to make the shift more bearable. Our shift started at 10 p.m. and ended at 6 a.m. We each had our assigned area. Mine was the East Wing, which included the food court and some stores. The routine was the same as always: sweeping, mopping, emptying trash, and leaving the bathrooms sparkling clean. The mall closed at about 7 p.m., and our shift started from there, so there was no one else in the whole place but us, so the silence was almost total, interrupted only by the distant hum of our cleaning machines. It was a bit scary, to be honest. One night, when I had been on the job for about 2 months, I noticed a strange smell in the food court. It was a mixture of stale food and something sour, pretty gross. I followed the trail of the smell to the back of a small smoothie stand in the back that had been closed for several months. As I approached, I looked across cautiously and saw a shadow moving behind the counter. My heart went pitter-patter. "Hey, hello," I called out, with my voice boomed down the deserted hallway. Not a soul answered. I approached carefully and peeked over the counter. To my surprise, I found a pile of dirty clothes and an old sleeping bag. I couldn't believe it. Someone had been living there. I stepped back carefully and then went out like a soul to find Marta and Carlos. I told them what I had seen, and the 3 of us decided to go back together to investigate. When we got to the smoothie stand, the person was gone, but it was clear that someone had been there. We alerted mall security, but they didn't seem too alarmed. They told us they would look into it and to go about our business. A few nights later, I was there, quietly emptying the garbage cans near the food court, when suddenly I felt someone watching me. You know, that uneasy feeling you get when someone is watching you, even if you can't see them. Well, at that moment, that feeling became very intense, and at one point, I could feel the presence of someone behind me. All the hairs on the back of my neck stood up and I slowly turned around. It was then that I found myself face to face with a guy who looked like he had been through hell. Matted hair, glassy eyes, and full of spider's gunk. He gave the impression that he hadn't eaten or slept in days, but also that he was under the effects of something else, since his teeth were clicking as he moved his jaw in a weird way. "Do you need anything?" I asked, trying to sound confident, though inside I was panicking. The man didn't say a word, just took a step toward me, which made me recoil. I then scanned him up and down, and that's when I realized he was holding a rusty knife in his hand. I started backing away slowly, trying to keep my cool, but my heart was pounding a mile a minute. "I'm just cleaning up. I don't want any trouble, just let me go home," I said, hoping he would relax a little, but the guy still had the same unfriendly face and that expression. He kept coming closer and closer, and I felt like I was going to have a heart attack. Seeing that the man had no intention of stopping, I ran to the nearest bathroom and locked myself inside. I leaned against the door, holding my breath as I heard his footsteps approaching, and then he stopped in front of the door. The guy tried to open it, shaking the handle angrily, but it wouldn't open, and then silence. I stood still, trying to hear any noise that would tell me where he was. I felt like my heart was going to burst out of my mouth at any moment. I was completely terrified and didn't know what to do. The fear I felt was so much that my mind was blocked. After what seemed like an eternity, I finally heard his footsteps walking away. I stayed in the bathroom for a while longer, trying to calm down. When I finally came out, the mall was deserted. I had to find Marta and Carlos as soon as possible. I ran through the aisles with 1,000 eyes and crying from sheer nerves until I finally found Marta near the entrance of a store. I hurriedly told her what had happened and she turned white as a sheet, so she called Carlos right away. The three of us met in the food court and Marta decided it was time to call the police. While we waited, we stood together, scared to death. The police arrived about 20 minutes later, took our statements and started searching the mall. We stayed in the security office watching the CCTV footage, looking for any clues about the guy. Suddenly, there he was, hiding in the shadows near one of the stores at the far end of the mall. On the screens, we watched as the cops fanned out through the aisles, but the guy was elusive, disappearing into the maze of stores and maintenance areas of the mall. The tension was palpable in the security office as we followed the chase on the cameras. After more than an hour trying to find the guy, he was finally cornered in a warehouse near the loading docks. There was a brief but intense struggle between the man and the agents, and then it was over. They dragged him out in handcuffs and took him away. After the police left, we tried to return to our duties, but the atmosphere was very charged. I kept feeling the adrenaline in my body and I couldn't get the image of that guy with the knife out of my head. The following nights were an ordeal. Every shadow, every noise made my hair stand on end. Marta, Carlos and I hardly talked about what had happened, but fear hung in the air. Later we learned that the man had been living in the mall for weeks, hiding in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. The idea that he had been there all that time, watching us without us noticing, gave me chills. From then on, whenever I worked at night, I felt uneasy, constantly looking over my shoulder. The paranoia I felt every night on my shift became so intense, I ended up quitting a month later. I really couldn't keep working there feeling that way. Since then, I have never worked the night shift again. I work for my dad in his small construction company. He takes care of the warehouse and yard, which is full of materials, and also oversees the construction work. I've been working for him since I was 17. Basically, I'm the go-to guy for everything. I carry materials back and forth, pick up whatever's needed. You know, the typical beginner's job. My father is a tough guy and he taught me and my brother from an early age that things are earned with hard work. So I never had preferential treatment with me because I was his. I could say I'm the hardest worker in the whole company. But I am not complaining, because I understand that this is an important lesson for my life, and if I am ever going to inherit this company, I must know very well how the work is done. Sometimes, depending on the project, certain materials have to be brought to the site before the workers arrive, so they can start first thing in the morning. So every once in a while during busy weeks I would have to start work very early, like 2 or 3 a.m., to make sure everything was on time. Obviously this only happened in the summer, when I didn't have classes, so I had no excuse not to do it. The truth is that I like to make the deliveries early. It was quiet and no one gave me any trouble. However, this changed one day. I arrived at the warehouse at 3 a.m. as usual, loaded up the truck and headed to the job site. It was a repair job on an old, almost abandoned building on the outskirts of town. When I arrived, I saw a pickup truck parked just ahead. The lights were off and there didn't seem to be anyone around. It was too early in the morning for anyone to be working, so I didn't expect to find any vehicles there. I parked and approached the van. It wasn't company-owned and the windows were smoked out, so I couldn't see inside. I turned around and looked toward the building, trying to see if anyone was there. I yelled out asking if anyone was inside, but got no response. I started to feel a little weird. Somehow this gave me a bad feeling. So I pulled out my phone and called my dad, but it went to voicemail. I figured it was probably some worker's truck that had left it there the night before. I didn't want to make a bigger deal out of it after all. Everything seemed to be calm. I went back to my truck and started unloading the materials. It took me about an hour. Then I got in and started to leave. But as I was leaving the construction site area, I looked in my rearview mirror and the lights of the other truck suddenly came on. I slammed on my brakes, pulled off to the side of the road, and watched as the truck started to back up. Someone had been there the whole time. I was sure it couldn't be a worker because they would have answered me when I yelled. I sat there watching as they pulled out of the parking lot and onto the road. I grabbed my phone and redialed my dad's number, and as I waited for him to suddenly answer, I looked up and saw that the van had pulled up right next to me. I stared out the window, aware that someone was watching me from inside. At that moment, it was as if my instinct was telling me, "Get out of there now." I threw the phone on the seat and accelerated forward immediately, but then the van kept up with me, preventing me from getting back on the main road. I had no escape. To my left were trees, and to my right, the van was blocking my path. Panic began to take over and my head felt like an espresso pod as I tried to figure out what to do. So I put it in reverse and tried to back up, but the van did the same. Then I felt them hit the side of my truck, making me lose control completely. I skidded off the road and crashed into a tree. At that moment, the van braked sharply, as if they were going to pull out, but then the brake lights went out and they accelerated at full speed, disappearing completely into the darkness. The crash rendered my van useless, and I took several blows from the impact, so I was dazed and starting to feel very dizzy. Just seconds later, another car braked on the side of the road and a man came running out towards me, asking me if I was okay. I was so shocked at the time that I couldn't remember his name, but I knew he was one of the workers who had just arrived at the construction site. He had only seen the last part of what happened, but he recognized the truck that hit me as that of Samuel, another worker my father had hired a few months ago. It turned out that there were a lot of tools and materials missing from the construction site, almost $10,000 worth, and that was just from that night alone. He could have been stealing bit by bit for months. I think what happened that night was that Samuel thought that if I saw his truck, it would all come down on him and he would get caught. So he tried to stop me. I don't know what he would have done to me, but considering I was the only witness, he probably would have gotten away with it if I had never been seen again. Now I'm sure his intention was to finish me off while I was still inside the van, crashed into the tree, but then he saw this other company van approaching and decided to run away. Unfortunately, his name and everything else led to nothing. It was likely that he was an illegal immigrant or some kind of criminal who had gone to the trouble of forging or stealing identity documents and work permits. I never expected something like this could happen, but at least it is highly unlikely that I will ever see this man again. I guess whoever said the phrase, "chaos always wins," was right. The hunger for some extra income to cover some debts led me to take a part-time job at a McDonald's, just a few blocks from my house. During the day, I had a job as an editor at a publishing house and left just in time for my night shift at the fast food place. Neither place had any objection to me working two jobs, so as long as I was willing to work without complaint, they were willing to hire me. I convinced the manager at McDonald's to assign me to the night shift permanently, and it was no problem for him, fortunately. My routine was always the same. Wake up every morning, cook, get ready for the day, and get to the publisher by 8 a.m. And once the clock struck 5 p.m., I would run out and find my way to the fast food place. After closing at 10 p.m., I would walk the few blocks that came before the condo where I lived. The sad part, however, was how tired I was every night after each one. Of course, it wasn't easy for a person to spend more than 12 hours away from home every day. But if things went well, I hoped to make enough money to cover my debt within 2 years and then take a break. But that drive didn't make up for the stress that overwhelmed me from time to time. I remember I used to love going to McDonald's and junk food joints in general. But after working every night watching a bunch of burger and fries orders come and go, this taste was ruined for me, but I digress. This happened one night after closing, when I was on my way home. When I was 2 blocks from getting to my neighborhood, I heard footsteps behind me. They were quiet and subtle, almost as if the person didn't want me to notice them. I didn't look back for a while, but when the perfect mix of the silent footsteps and the darkness became present in an alley, I started to feel scared, so I decided to turn around to see who was coming behind me. As I did so, the person behind me, who was approximately 5 or 6 meters away, started to run, crossed the curb, and turned the corner. At that point, obviously without thinking, I started running after him to try to catch up and see who it was. I approached the end of the block but couldn't get anywhere near it, so I turned around and chose to go home another way. However, every now and then I would nervously turn around to make sure no one was following me. I really hated the fear that little encounter planted in me. That night when I got home, I double-checked my locks and closed all the windows. Even the windows in my bedroom, which was at the top of the house, curled up in bed, afraid and praying that what happened earlier was nothing more than a bad joke by one of my friends. But the truth is that deep down, a part of me was sure that wasn't the case. The muffled sleep must have erased the memory of the previous night's scare, because when I woke up the next morning I had completely forgotten about the chase and the mysterious stalker. So I followed my usual routine and got ready for work at 8 a.m. I was distracted working at my desk at the publishing house a few minutes after 5 p.m. When I looked up at the wall clock and realized that I was running late for my next shift, I immediately put what I was doing on hold for the next day, shut down my computer, grabbed my stuff, and rushed off to the restaurant. I arrived at McDonald's for my night shift a little late that day, and as I walked through the door, the manager looked at me with a raised eyebrow. I gave him an apologetic nod and immediately began my work. I didn't expect anything strange that night, and up to that point, everything was going the same as usual, just like any other workday. Customers were coming and going, but around 8 p.m., almost 3 hours after I arrived, I noticed a seat that was still occupied by the same person from several hours ago. In fact, I was almost sure I had seen that same man sitting there when I arrived. I brought it to the attention of one of my companions, and he agreed that the man occupying the seat had been there even long before I arrived. This piqued my interest not because he looked forlorn and out of sorts, but because every time I turned to look at the man, he looked away, as if he had been studying me the whole time. At that moment, I remembered a tactic I had seen in a YouTube video. It was a kind of psychological trick that consisted in yawning and waiting to see if the other person yawned too. If he did it, is because that person is watching you. This is because yawning is contagious. It is one of those curiosities of the human brain. The thing is that I did it, and it worked. I pretended to be yawning, and when I turned to look at the man, although he turned his head away immediately, I noticed that he also yawned, so I realized that my suspicions were true. This guy had been watching me for a while, or maybe since I arrived. I decided to do something about the whole strange situation and inform my manager, but since we were close to closing time, he lazily concluded that the man would leave after the store closed and that he wouldn't hurt anyone. To be honest, on the call it sounded like he didn't want to be bothered with whatever he was doing that night, so I let it go. True to what my manager said, once closing time came, the man left without being asked, although he didn't ask for anything either. That must have been a big red flag for me, but I didn't even stop to think about it, so I closed up shop, made sure everything was in order, and started my journey home. Being honest, I wouldn't have remembered what happened to me last night, not if it hadn't happened to me again. I wasn't far away when I heard the same footsteps behind me, slow and subtle, as if the person wanted, and at the same time didn't want to be noticed. I turned more sharply than the night before and didn't wait for the guy to run but ran in his direction in the dark. But then a person ran into my path, and that gave the guy the advantage, who rushed out in front of me. In the end, I didn't catch up with him that night either. I really hated how fatigue had reduced me to the weakest version of myself. If it was any other day, or a day when I hadn't had to work all day, I would have caught the guy, but at least I was glad I realized something. The person wasn't young and they always ran in a zigzag. The next day when I arrived at McDonald's, I was surprised to see the man who had lingered the day before at the same place again. Perhaps, if he didn't bother the customers with his unmannerly eyes and drooling, I would have left him. But that day there were so many complaints about him that he had to be asked to leave the place, but he stubbornly refused, so I was forced to alert my male companions about the man refusing to move. My companions tried to persuade him, but he continued with his obtuse behavior. I saw the frustration in everyone's eyes, so I decided to lend a hand in the matter. I once volunteered at a refugee camp, so I had some knowledge about handling weirdos. I finally approached the table and talked to the man, and as soon as I did, he reasoned with me and agreed to leave on one condition. "Please escort me out," he said. I nodded and followed the man as he walked out of the building. A terrible mistake on my part. I shouldn't have let my guard down, but how was I to know he had a knife with him? We had barely set foot outside. He suddenly pulled his hand out of his coat, and before I could even react, he plunged the sharp weapon into my stomach twice without mercy. Feeling the stabbing pain, I screamed and then fell to the ground. My coworkers approached me as I watched the man flee the site running in a zigzag pattern. I should have known, or at least suspected that he was the stalker. I don't know how I was so careless as to not have thought of that. Perhaps the state of physical and mental exhaustion I was constantly in due to my double workday had something to do with the fact that my mind was not sharp enough to notice the similarity between this man and the one who followed me at night on my way home. Blood gushed through my stomach like an open faucet, and I wished with all my might that it wasn't as bad as I thought, and that I wasn't dying. But my eyes began to close, and even though I clung tightly to consciousness, my body finally succumbed and my senses shut down. Fortunately, I reopened my eyes a few hours later. The detective standing guard beside me said that my surgery had been a success, and I would soon be released from the hospital. I was in extreme pain at the time, but at least I was thankful that I didn't end up dead, or worse, alive and disabled. I asked about the man who attacked me, and the detective assured me that he had been caught and arrested. The detective also said that the man confessed to stabbing me, but he didn't say the reason, or even make up any excuse to justify what he did. Instead, he coldly and blatantly stated that he just wanted to try out the new knife he had bought, and felt that I was the perfect prey for that. Hearing this, I felt a strange mixture of anger and fear that I had never experienced before. I told the police about the stalking, and the evidence let me know that the man was the same. The officer took my statement and assured me that the man would pay for his crime. I thanked him for his efforts and really hoped he would. 2 weeks later, I was discharged. I still did not quit my job at McDonald's, although I worked under constant fear. In fact, I was working there, and on the same shift, for over a year after the incident. My husband, Nestor, and I were spending Saturday night at home together. It was just a normal night, I thought. We had both had a hard week of work, and that day we just wanted to rest and spend some time together. Just watch some Netflix and eat the leftovers left in the fridge from the week, so we were sitting and talking about I don't remember what in our living room, when in the middle of our conversation, Nestor's cell phone rang. He answered, talked to whoever was on the other end of the line for a while, and then listened quietly. After that, he said one word, "Okay," and without even looking at me, put on his shoes and ran out of the house. I was a little puzzled, but I figured he would come back in a few moments and explain what was going on, but he never did. I waited on the couch for about 30 minutes before trying to call him, but he didn't answer. After an hour, I was extremely confused and scared. In all our years of marriage, Nestor had never done anything like this before. Finally, I called 911 and explained what was happening to my husband. The dispatcher listened to my story and told me there was nothing she could do. She told me to wait in the house until he returned, and if he hadn't returned by morning, then if I should call again. At that point, I started to panic, but I tried to calm down. I needed a simple explanation as to why my husband would just leave without saying where and for so long. I still couldn't help but worry, but I tried to stay calm and think positive so I wouldn't collapse. I went to the kitchen, made myself some chamomile tea, and after drinking it, I went to sleep. But as you can imagine, I couldn't sleep a wink. In the middle of the night, my phone rang. I quickly grabbed it and saw that it was Nestor. Instantly, I was filled with relief and quickly answered. But the voice on the other end was not Nestor's. It was another man's voice, but it sounded fake, as if the caller was using some voice modifier. "Do you want to see your husband again?" the man asked. "Who are you?" I asked back, starting to panic. The man did not answer, but instead gave me directions. The guy said Nestor was in the woods behind his house. explained that he was safe, but that he needed me to go look for him. He told me exactly where I should look, and I tried one more time to ask who he was, but the guy just said, "Be quick, you have 20 minutes and don't involve the police or Nestor will be sorry," then hung up. I ran out of the house and followed the man's instructions to the letter, making my way through the dark, twisted trees. I wasn't thinking clearly, and I didn't even bring my phone with me. I'm terrible at acting under pressure, and I had never felt more pressured than during that night. I ran through the darkness, looking around frantically to see if anyone was hiding behind the trees, but all was extremely quiet. Finally, I saw a clearing up ahead and thought that this was where I would find Nestor, and that the nightmare would finally end, but in reality, this was where it began. As I was about to enter the dead clearing, my foot sank into the ground. I stepped on a tarp covered with dead grass. Then I crouched down and realized that someone had dug a very deep hole in the ground and covered it with a tarp. It was obviously a trap, and whoever had brought me here wanted me to fall into it. But fortunately for me, for some reason, the trap failed. I stepped back, careful not to get too close to the hole, and hid behind a tree. This was the moment I realized I didn't have my phone with me, and I cursed for that. I looked around, but everything was silent and still. For a long moment I didn't know what to do. That's when I saw a big rock next to me. I grabbed it and threw it towards the trap, and it landed in the center of the tarp and then sank into the hole with a loud thud. At that point I screamed very loudly as if I was in a lot of pain and waited to see what would happen. A couple of minutes later I saw someone come out of the darkness, but to my surprise, it was Nestor. At that moment my heart dropped to the floor. This meant that whoever was behind it all was him, Nestor himself. He must have been the one who dug the hole and set this trap for me. He must have been the one who planned it all, but why? It didn't make sense. Nestor stood on the edge of the hole and looked down, looking for me at the bottom of the hole. Obviously, he saw nothing. That's when I jumped out of my hiding place and pushed him from behind. He gasped in surprise and then fell straight down the hole. I heard a horrible crack when he landed. I was sure something broke, so I walked over and stood right on the edge, and from there I looked down. "What are you trying to do?" I asked, feeling terribly betrayed. Then Nestor started crying. We were married for 6 years and I had never seen him cry before. It was horrible. He didn't even wipe his face. He just let the tears fall like a waterfall. Nestor said it wasn't his idea, that someone was making him do this, and if I didn't let it out it would be killing him. But I was too angry and confused to believe anything he said. I demanded that he tell me everything, but he only cried harder and begged me to let him off. He said he would explain everything to me once we were safely inside the house, but I simply couldn't do that, because I lost all my trust in him and feared he might hurt me. So instead of doing as he asked, I ran back home, leaving him alone at the bottom of the hole. Once I got home, I reached for my cell phone and called the police. An officer arrived fairly quickly and went back to the woods where Nestor was, but when I got there, the hole was empty. Nestor was gone. 3 months have passed and I still don't know what happened to my husband. The police spent weeks searching around the forest, but apart from the tarp, they couldn't find any trace of Nestor. That same night when I returned home, I logged onto his computer to see if there was any explanation. I looked at his recent emails, but could find nothing. Then I checked his private bank account and saw that someone had transferred thousands of dollars into his account the day before he disappeared. That only left more questions. Who had paid him, and why? Was this some kind of payment for turning me in? After all, the one who was supposed to be in the hole was me. I want to think that Nestor is still out there somewhere, hiding until it's safe to return. But deep down, I know he's gone for good. A few weeks after his disappearance, I started searching the internet for similar cases and asking on forums about possible causes. But the hypotheses were not encouraging at all. In fact, each one was creepier than the other. One of them was that my husband was probably involved with some white slavery or organ trafficking group and that he had probably sold me. And when he didn't get what he expected, these guys took it out on himself. However, that is something I may never know for sure. When I was a kid in the 90s, I used to seriously hate going to school. There was at least one day a month when I woke up and decided in my head that I was staying home. I would do whatever it took, pretend to throw up, hit the toilet, cry, whatever. And most of the time it worked. My parents were working class, all-day laborers, so they couldn't afford to stay home or argue with me and fall behind at work. So when I was in 4th grade, at age 10, they would just let me stay home alone on the days I pretended to be sick. I remember one morning I woke up and I didn't have to fake anything. My stomach was really in knots, my throat was on fire, and I couldn't even hold back my own saliva. For my parents, this had become habitual. Seemingly anything had me throwing up due to my habit of faking being sick to stay home. But while I really was sick this time, I was determined to have a little fun, even at the cost of a little discomfort. So I laid back in the recliner, what I considered a gaming chair, and played some of my favorite video games. The upstairs bathroom was around the corner from my room, down the hall. For no particular reason, this bathroom scared me from the first day we moved into that house. I always believed that ghosts came out there, even though I had no real reason to believe this. Just the fact that, according to my 10-year-old self, I saw things in that place. Somehow I cooked up all those ideas in my head, but the reality was that there was a window high up in the wall that cast strange shadows at the base of the wall. I knew that, but I liked to scare myself and my friends every time they came over. Being home alone that day and needing to pee urgently, I decided I would go downstairs to use the bathroom and then peek in our fridge. But when I got up from my chair, I thought I saw something strange out of the corner of my eye. It looked like the shadow of a large, menacing man in the corner of the hallway, where the window I told you about was. This frightened me, of course, but at the time I was undecided whether it was a ghost or a real person. But I did nothing at once, for I thought that if it was a real person, I would at least hear him walking. I walked cautiously, went into the bathroom, did my business, and then headed to the kitchen. The fridge was right next to our front door, so as I looked inside, I was parallel to the front door knob. Then as I looked inside the fridge looking for a piece of cake, ice cream, or something I could snack on, I heard something strange, a clinking sound. I would immediately go to the door, and exactly what I thought was happening. The front door knob was moving back and forth. It was locked, thank goodness, as my parents were very careful about security, especially when I was home alone. So even the deadbolt was even locked. But still, I knew right away that it wasn't anyone living here. We lived in a pretty good neighborhood in average-sized suburbia, but in my mind, at that moment, anything was possible. Next to the door was a large window, and I saw something moving back and forth beyond the curtain. When I turned to that place, total horror. There was a skinny, ugly old man leaning with his hands on the glass and looking into the house. His eyes went from left to right, then suddenly fell on me, and my heart stopped for an instant. The old man had this big, horrible grin spreading across his hideous face, and he started banging on the glass like he was an animal at the zoo. I remember slamming the fridge so hard I could hear everything moving inside. My adrenaline was at its peak at that moment. I thought my mom was going to kill me when I got home and opened the fridge because of the ooze I was sure to find in it. I remember being more worried about that than the creepy guy looking out the window. Now, as I told you, I was 10 years old when this happened, so I pictured myself as a tall, strapping young man in my head. I was also used to staying home alone and had dealt with many different people coming to our door. Electric and water department workers, gas men, Mormon ladies, Jehovah's Witnesses, and any number of other people prone to knocking on the door. I ran through a mental checklist as I looked this creep up and down. He definitely wasn't here to see my mom or dad, and he definitely didn't fit any of the profiles I just mentioned. He wasn't even knocking on the door. I mean, if there's a red flag, this guy was holding it firmly and high in his hand. "Hey, why don't you come open the door?" he said, pointing toward the handle. "I was just here yesterday," he then said. My head starts swimming. What is this guy talking about? What do you mean yesterday? Does he work for my dad? Does he know my older sister? I took a step forward because I was so off guard that he almost caught me for a second. I was about to open the door out of denial, hoping for some kind of rational explanation, but I held back after that first step. I shook my head and thought, "No way, dude." Then he shook his head too, and next he started kicking the siding of the house as hard as if he were a wrestler, when in truth he was a scrawny old man, but his punches were so violent that I felt as if the wall was shaking and I jumped back. The whole kitchen was behind me, and to my right, where the living room began, were the stairs to the bedrooms. On the other side of the kitchen was a small hallway that led back to my parents' bedroom, plus the laundry room, a bathroom, and then the side entrance to the garage. When I remember the garage, this whole plan turns into action in my head, and to this day, I have never had a cleaner, more pragmatic line of thinking as I did that day. It bums me out a bit, to tell you the truth, and I've been told it's because that's the only time my life has really been on the line. Anyway, the thing is, we kept a lot of stuff in the garage, like our camping and outdoor gear, which also included my special cheap paintball gun from Walmart. It was one of those clear gray pump-action guns. It would take the CO2 cylinder at the bottom of the handle and launch a paintball hard enough to break a window, I know from experience. I grabbed it right away, changed the cylinder out of habit because I knew that whoever was out there trying to defile my house had to be annihilated. I pushed a couple of handfuls of paintballs into the hopper, and now I was ready to go into battle. That's when I looked over and saw something else we kept in the garage, a wooden log that had a small axe sticking out of the top. I tucked it into my pajama pants that I was wearing, because it was like a miniature version of a real axe, which was actually about the size of a knife. After I got arsenal ready, I crept down the hallway, and now I could hear the guy playing with the door, so when I look around the corner, he's no longer looking out the window. I ran out as fast as my sick little body would let me, through the kitchen and then up the stairs, landing in my room, where I planned to barricade myself. I was fully prepared to shoot the guy to death if he came up the stairs, and if that didn't deter him, I'd have to use the axe. My plan was foolproof, but something told me to stop. I came up with something better. Instead of my room, I went around the corner and headed for the creepy bathroom down the hall. It was crazy, but something told me this was the best plan, so I stopped and went straight to the bathroom. I opened the window as quietly as I could, as I knew that if I could get through the opening, the ceiling was easy to walk on. This wasn't the first time I had pulled this stunt. I had already snuck onto the ceiling several times this way, so I knew if I crawled I would be able to make it. I executed my plan flawlessly, and when I was on the roof, I spotted the front door and crawled up on my tiptoes, being careful not to stand too high or step too hard. When I peeked out very carefully, I saw that he was still working on the door, but now he had a screwdriver. I couldn't believe he was trying to disassemble the lock. At that point, I took a deep breath, gripped the gun tightly in my hands, and started shouting out combat video game quotes, even the hardest ones I could remember from the games that were out there at the time. Obviously, I also added a series of profanities, and when I started screaming like that, the guy jumped in fright. That moment was glorious for me, seeing this creepy man scared. That brief moment opened up a whole new confidence in me. It was like a rush of courage straight into my veins. Then I started throwing paintballs at him like a city Rambo. Chest, hands, face, throat. I shot him everywhere, black and blue green. I was literally only 15 or 20 feet away from him, and I had shot that thing 1,000,000 times by that point in my life. So my aim was formidable. If I could hit a dog turd from 50 feet away, a grown man was too easy a target. I'll never forget how he started screaming at the top of his lungs, completely terrified. I think he thought I was really shooting at him, as those old single-pump paintball guns were very loud when they fired. Plus that instantaneous sharp sting he felt probably made him think it was real, at least for a few seconds. The guy started moving around the corners of the porch, trying to protect himself from the shots, and at one point he was out of my sight. But it was probably at that point that he realized they weren't real bullets. Then he pulled himself together and then started shouting threats of all kinds. He was saying them all in a deep, creepy voice that he didn't have before, as he was asking me to open the door to the house. I ran to the other side of the roof, and by God, there he was, lurking in the opposite corner. I don't even need to tell you that I finally let this guy go, but this time I watched him. The guy hopped the fence, walked back to the little creek that separated some houses, rinsed the paint off him, then wandered down the road, and would you believe it? I watched him minutely every step he took. Once he disappeared from my sight, I quickly ran inside the house, obviously without dropping my guns like a good soldier, and grabbed our phone. I wanted to call the police, but I opted to call my mom. She worked much closer and could get home at least a little faster. I told her everything that happened, and she called my dad right away. They both showed up not long after, and it was only when I saw them walk in the door that I finally broke down, as the reality that I was really in danger hit me very hard. Up until then, adrenaline had been in charge of keeping me alert and in a fighting stance, but now, in front of my parents, my body started to cool down, and I felt very overwhelmed by everything that had just happened. And to be honest, this little soldier cried like a baby for quite a while in his mother's lap. But as hard as it is to believe, the story was actually even crazier. In talking to my parents, they told me that someone had been in our house the day before, and they were very intrigued because when they came home from work, they noticed that some things had been moved around the house. They saw that the window was open in their bedroom, some of the books were moved, clothes were also moved, and someone left a cigarette in the bathroom sink. They knew it wasn't us kids. Obviously, none of us smoked. They made sure to lock the doors, but other than that, they really didn't know what to make of it. So they talked to some neighbors and found out that houses had been happening throughout our neighborhood in the last few weeks. 2 or 3 houses had already been burglarized and a 4th house that was on its own. But it was learned that over a dozen had been investigated and appraised and then burglarized, including ours. He had a particular modus operandi. He would arrive at a house, assess it from the outside, and look inside to locate where the valuables were and what the best access points were, then stalk the owners to learn their routines and then return, just as everyone was leaving, and take what he wanted. I always wondered what would have happened if this guy had actually entered the house and found me inside. As you can imagine, I have cameras everywhere in my house and a formidable security system, also a big .357 revolver instead of that paintball gun, and all thanks to that weirdo from my childhood. When I moved overseas, I couldn't call my mom, so I convinced her to download WhatsApp so we could message each other whenever we wanted. She wasn't very tech-savvy, so I had to help her set everything up before I left. I had to explain things to her over and over again before she was comfortable with the app. Soon after, I flew to my new place in Italy and sent Mom a text message telling her I had arrived. She responded with a heart emoticon. From then on, Mom and I were constantly texting each other. It was strange, but even though we were on the other side of the world, I felt closer to her than ever. We talked more on WhatsApp than ever when we lived in the same city. I told her all about my new job and my new house, and she told me about all the crazy things going on at home. She told me about her karaoke night and the date she went on, and her new yoga class. She sounded like a complete teenager. I guess she was waiting for me to finally move out of the house before she started having a social life of her own. I was so proud of her, and also proud of myself for my new accomplishments. About 3 weeks after I moved in, Mom sent me a very strange message. "Do you know someone named Joe?" It was a very common name, but I couldn't think of any specific Joe that I was close to, so I told her no. She explained that she had made a new friend on WhatsApp named Joe, who said he was one of my friends from college. She said he seemed really nice and was a good guy, and then my heart sank. I asked him if he had a picture of this person, and he sent me a picture of a very handsome blonde man. I had never seen him before in my life. I instantly did a reverse Google image search, and sure enough, the photo was made by AI. Joe was not a real person, just as I suspected. I tried to call Mom to explain everything directly, but she didn't answer. She texted me that she didn't know how to receive calls on WhatsApp, even though I had already shown her how. So I just texted back explaining that Joe was a scammer and that I should block him. Her response was, "I don't know how to block people, and I don't think he's a scammer. He seems really nice." My mom is an amazing person, but I was always worried that she would fall for some internet scam because she is overly trusting, and her lack of computer skills made her particularly vulnerable to these types of situations. I kept trying to warn her about Joe, but she wouldn't listen, until I finally gave up and sent a message to my cousins asking them to visit Mom and try to reason with her. They said they would, but then I never heard anything more. The next day, Mom sent me a message again. This one said that Joe had asked her for some money to help with the hospital bills where she had confined her poor mother, who was suffering from a very serious illness. I told her once again to stop talking to him, but she said it was too late. She had already sent him $2,000 to support him. I can't tell you how frustrated I was listening to her. It was like talking to a concrete wall. She didn't want to accept for the world that her new friend wasn't one at all, and that he was just a scammer. I called my uncle, who also lived in my hometown, and told him the situation. He said he would go talk to her, but he called me an hour later saying that Mom denied everything, pretending she had no idea what I was talking about. I felt angrier and more frustrated than ever. It seemed like there was nothing I could do to save Mom from this scammer. She wouldn't listen to me and denied everything in my uncle's face. I just hoped the guy would leave her alone now that he got his money out of her. But unfortunately, that's not what happened. Mom texted me in the middle of the night saying she was going to visit Joe at the hospital where he was staying overnight to be in her mother's care now that she had undergone surgery. "Don't go," I texted her in all caps. She didn't respond after that, but then an hour after I went back to sleep, she texted me again. He wasn't at the hospital, and added a sad face emoji. "Because he's not real, Mom," I told her. I hoped this would finally knock some sense into her, but she replied that it wasn't, because he texted back and assured her that he had to go out emergency shopping for his mother's care. I was so frustrated at that point I simply turned my phone off. If Mom was going to allow herself to continue to be scammed, then I was simply going to stay out of it, because nothing I could say would change her mind. I didn't hear from her for the next few days. I was worried, but I asked my cousins to visit her and they told me Mom was fine. She was at home watching TV. That made me feel at least a little better. The next night, Mom finally texted me again. "I haven't heard from you, is everything okay?" I told her I was fine, but didn't mention Joe. Then she wrote, "Well, I'm finally meeting Joe tomorrow. I'll take pictures when I see him to prove he's real." I told her not to go, begged her, wrote a long emotional message explaining how much he meant to me and how she was putting herself in danger by continuing to deal with this miscreant. But she didn't even respond. The next day was the start of my vacation for my new job, and there was some sort of festival in Italy. I planned to spend the week exploring my new city, but with my mother acting like a naive 15-year-old, I knew I had to fly back home and finally arranged to fly back to my country and try to save my mother from her own immaturity. Paradoxical, isn't it? I got the first available flight, which was surprisingly cheap because it was last minute, and finally flew all the way back to the US. The whole flight, I was furious that I had to sacrifice my own vacation to save my mom from her own irresponsibility. The plane landed in the afternoon, and I texted my mom to see where she was. She sent me an address and I texted, "Is this where you're meeting Joe?" "Yes," she texted back. I texted again, "I'm on my way there. I'll come get you to take you home." She didn't respond. I ordered an Uber at the airport and gave her the address. We drove for half an hour until we ended up at an old warehouse on the outskirts of town, which looked like the sketchiest place ever. I asked the Uber driver to wait there, and then ran out of the car to find Mom. I saw a black van parked in the back, but I didn't see Mom's car, so I texted her asking if she was still there. Instantly, I got a reply. "I have your mother. If you give me $10,000, I'll let her go." I almost fainted. I swear to God, I don't know how I could stand up. I started looking in all directions and saw no one outside, so I had to go into the warehouse, but before I did, I took a very deep breath to calm my nerves because I felt like I was about to have a panic attack. After that microscopic pause, I ran inside. As I entered, a man was waiting for me. "Just in time," he said, and grabbed my arms very tightly. As he held me, 3 other men stepped out of the shadows and took my phone and wallet. I demanded to know where my mom was, but the man just laughed. "How am I supposed to know when you've been talking to me the whole time?" At first I didn't understand, and then, when the men started tying me up, I realized the terrible mistake I had been making all along. The WhatsApp messages were not from my mom. They had all been a scammer posing as my mom and somehow using her number to manipulate me, to the point of forcing me to come. I thought they were scamming my mom, but in reality I was the one being scammed. I felt so stupid at that moment, and the worst part is that now I had no idea what they were going to do to me. At that moment, the Uber driver started honking his horn over and over again outside the store, and all the men froze. "Did you bring anyone with you?" the ringleader asked me. "Yes," I said, "and if you don't let me go, he will stop you." One of the men looked through the dusty warehouse window and said, "It looks like the guy is walking away." I felt like screaming, but I couldn't because they stuffed a dirty rag in my mouth. They kept me tied up and stole everything I had, then used my phone to empty my bank account, and after that, they chloroformed me to sleep. When I woke up, I was no longer tied up, but all my things were gone. I walked back to the road and hitchhiked all the way back to my mom's house. She was surprised to see me arrive, and especially in that condition. I told her what had happened, and she said, "See, that's why I didn't want to use WhatsApp. There are too many scammers." I'm retired now, but I worked as an inspector for both private companies and the county throughout my career. Once, a private home builder asked me to inspect a house in the middle of construction, and then they would send my inspection to the county. I got to the right place, walked in, and started doing my job, wandering around with a clipboard and a flashlight. Everything is pretty routine, until I got to the back of the house, where I could hear some strange noises. Looking around, there seemed to be garbage strewn about in some of the rooms, and suddenly I heard a buzzing sound, like a radio or something. Then it dawned on me. There's probably a contractor here, someone finishing drywall or something. With that in mind, I peek into the master bedroom, and inside I see a woman. But this one didn't look at all like a construction worker or someone that has to do with real estate at all. This woman was very dirty, disheveled, and she was around 30 or 35. Maybe she was repairing something and was an extremely sloppy worker. Or what do I know? I don't like to judge people right off the bat. "Excuse me, are you supposed to be in here?" I asked, hoping I was wrong and it did have something to do with housework or something like that. "Of course I do. I'm the owner's wife. What are you doing in my house?" she replied. This response surprised me significantly. I was expecting anything, but not that. I'm the home inspector. I scheduled with your husband and the contractor to do a full walkthrough." "I guess I didn't realize anyone would be here," I said. She grumbled and gave me some kind of answer. Then she disappeared into the bathroom area. Not all of the drywall was up, so I could still see her feet and arms as she crawled around making these strange noises. At this point, I started to freak out and was ready to get out of there. This was long before the pocket cell phone, so I was alone out there and couldn't communicate with anyone, at least until I could get to some public phone box, which at that time were plentiful all over town. But in that particular location there were none, so I set out to get back to my car. But before I could retreat, the woman came back from the bathroom with the biggest kitchen knife I've ever seen in my life and planted it through a piece of hanging drywall. At that point, I took a step back out of pure instinct and asked her what the hell she was doing, although what came out of my mouth sounded something like, why, what are you doing?" She replied in an angry tone. "I don't have a husband, so I think you need to leave," she said. I looked around the floor and all I could see was a pile of garbage, food wrappers, toilet paper tissues, empty bottles. This lady was crazy, and just as I first suspected, she was homeless and had just moved in. From the looks of it, she had been sleeping there for at least a couple of days without anything disturbing her. Now the only thing disturbing her was me, and I was stuck there with her. "Okay," I said without hesitation, making simple logic prevail. "It's time for me to go." I left my clipboard on a shelf and checked my pockets for my car keys, and started up toward the exit. "Don't leave your photos here, they'll want them back at the station," she says, pointing to my clipboard. I shake my head and hold up my hands to show them empty and keep moving backwards. She doesn't like this. She starts breathing weird, like super loud and deep. I took my own deep breath and grabbed that clipboard again, anything to lighten the woman's mood, but this triggered her even worse somehow. This lady started screaming like some kind of demonic spirit and started running towards me, and I almost fell backwards from fright. I took off running, trying to get away, only to stumble head-on into a slightly older, shirtless, tattoo-covered guy who came out of anywhere. I had no idea. He was definitely a junkie. "You woke me up," he said angrily. "You shouldn't be here. Why did you wake me up?" I tried to respond, but what the hell was I going to tell this guy? His look alone told me he wasn't willing to reason with anyone, so I wasn't going to talk to him. Then the woman came back down the hall, and between the two of them, she had me cornered. "This guy says my husband sent him. the woman said to the tattooed guy. Long story short, she threw me right under the bus. Then the guy started losing his mind, started breathing heavily as if he was filling with rage and contorting himself in a weird way. Then he started asking me in an aggressive manner about how the woman's husband could find them where they were. It didn't take me long to realize that I was dealing with a person under the influence of substances. The man's eyes were moving from side to side and I could tell he was having some sort of paranoid attack. But the scary thing about it was that I was his target. I assured them that I didn't know the guy, had nothing to do with it, that I was just there to simply look at the house. But I made a mistake and got the wrong address and assured them that I would leave without any more trouble and they would never see me again. Apparently, at least from what I surmised, they were running from this lady's husband. And from the little conversation they had afterwards, I realized that this was a drug dealer they owed. They were going out of town on foot and saw the partial construction on their own, so this became their lair for at least about 48 hours. I tried to convince them in every way I could that I had nothing to do with this dealer they owed, but no matter what I said, they were simply more than convinced that I was a henchman for the woman's husband, that I had found them, and now this man wanted to take care of me in true street style. This, without a doubt, was by far the most terrifying confrontation I could have in my life. Firstly, because I was totally unprepared to face not one, but two crazies in full delirium. They started to approach slowly, in a very scary way, he showing his muscles and she still with the huge knife in her hand. But as they approached, it occurred to me that the only ace up my sleeve was the information they themselves had provided me with. So I made up a last-minute lie, not knowing if it was really going to work. But I had to try because my life was at stake, literally, and fortunately it worked. I told the woman, "Your husband is not going to like any of this. You know he is out, right?" Before she could complete the sentence, both jaws immediately hit the floor and then ran to the window to do what junkies do, sniff through the blinds, look in all directions like a true madman, and corroborate if the mobster was really outside. Seeing that they were too distracted, trying to locate the man who probably wanted to hunt them down, I proceeded to back slowly through the house until I made good distance. When I was sure I had a considerable head start, I ran as fast as I could to get back to my car. I was horrified when I looked back to find them chasing me across the front yard. They were much paler and thinner than they looked to me inside the house. In the sunlight, they were even creepier because of their appearance, looking like a couple of zombies or something. I dropped my keys in the dirt before I could unlock my car, but I quickly bent down to grab them and started running again. As soon as I got to my car, I immediately opened the door, got in, started it up in a split second, pushed the gas pedal to the floor, and pretty much didn't let go until I saw the parking lot of my building in front of me. As soon as I arrived, I called the owner of the building and notified him about the situation and directly told him that I didn't want to work on the property inspection because I really had no intention of ever setting foot on that site again. Last I heard, these people had fled the site and the owner was finally able to carry out the project he had for the property, but honestly, I don't regret doing without that particular job at all. I live in an RV, so I'm constantly moving around the country, but a few months out of the year I have to stay in one area for an extended time, this in order to accumulate some money before moving on. At the time, I was staying somewhere in southern Utah and had taken a job at a gas station. This was located on a road that was really only used by locals to get in and out of the state, without having to deal with freeway traffic, so there was nothing else on this route. It was just a road with a lone gas station for casual drivers, so the job was perfect for me, because the location didn't matter to me. It's one of the fascinating things about living on wheels, so I decided to stay there for a while and work anyway. I had been there for a little over a month, and up to this point, I was still working random shifts. That day I was working from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. It really wasn't a special night by any means, but like all the previous ones, almost no customers aside from the one or two that stopped at the pumps. And not much to do, really. Most of the time I was just standing around looking at my phone or walking around the store and making the shelves look nice. That night, however, at about 1 a.m., a customer pulled into the station parking lot, in one of the few spaces right in front of the door. Seeing him, I went back to the counter to serve him. The man got out of his car and walked into the store. He looked at me, smiled, and then nodded. I nodded back, and he continued down one of the aisles. As I was checking the grocery aisle, the man started whistling as he looked at a couple of things, picking them up and putting them back, then continued down the next aisle and repeated that same action. I wasn't sure if he was just taking a break from driving or if he really needed something, but the items he was picking up and looking at were all different and he didn't really seem interested in buying them. Then he abruptly stopped whistling, walked over to the door and left. At the time, I didn't think he stole anything, but it was strange. The guy got into his car and through the windshield, which had no smoked paper on it, I could see that he started looking for something in the back seat before getting back out of his car and walking back into the store. After seeing what he had just done, I didn't feel too comfortable. I didn't know what it was he had been looking for in the back seat or why he had returned to the store. I wanted to think that maybe he had left his wallet there and that was what he had gone out to get. But I wasn't too convinced as, judging by his odd attitude, this seemed almost exactly how I thought an armed robbery would start. However, the assault I expected when he re-entered the store didn't happen. Instead, he approached the counter and asked me how my night was going, starting a quick back and forth of small talk. I acted as normally as I could, trying to disguise the fact that I was overthinking everything. But then, he asked me if I could help him with his car, said his tires needed air, and that he didn't see any pumps outside this station. The truth is, I didn't have any air pumps at the gas station, but I did carry a handheld air compressor for emergency situations, so I pulled it out and followed him to his car. He pointed down to where the tire was that needed air, and I bent down, placing the line on the compressor. I had it there for less than 10 seconds, while I read the pressure, which turned out to be at the correct level. I then looked up at the man to tell him the tire was okay. But when I did, what I saw was his fist coming straight for my face. I fell to the ground stunned and tried to get up, but then the man started kicking me wildly. I started screaming at him to stop, curling up on the ground and covering my head with my arms, trying to protect myself, but he kept kicking me mercilessly and without giving me a chance at anything. The way he was doing it was so brutal. I felt each blow as if I was being hit with a hammer, and I really thought it was the end of me. Finally, the man stopped kicking me, and as I lay on the ground in pain, motionless and barely half-conscious, I watched in horror as he pulled a knife from his belt, and in a swift manner and without any hesitation whatsoever, put it to my neck and slid it from side to side. This happened in a split second, but to me it felt like it was in slow motion, as I could feel the edge of the blade on every millimeter of my skin. Instinctively, I brought my hands to the wound, trying to hold back the gushing blood, but I knew it was useless. No one survives a cut to the jugular, so I just stood there, in a fetal position, looking out into the darkness of the deserted road ahead, bleeding out as the guy walked calmly towards the store. I don't know how much time passed, but I began to hear the man's footsteps approaching. I was still conscious, although I didn't know for how much longer. In fact, I was surprised that I hadn't died yet, as I understood that a cut in the neck meant a quick death. And although I was sure that my death was imminent anyway, the survival instinct is something that just doesn't go out as long as I had some life left. So I decided to close my eyes and play dead when I heard him approaching. Standing there, I could hear the man put a bunch of stuff inside the van. You could hear the sound of the items bumping into each other and being piled in the back seat. Then I heard him stop his steps to the side of me. I knew he was looking at me. I could feel it, so I held my breath and stood as still as I could. A couple of seconds later, I heard him get into the truck, turn it on, and felt the tires brush against me as I backed out of the parking lot. I heard the car pull out of the spot and onto the highway, and when I stopped hearing the engine, I got up off the ground as best I could, still pressing my neck with my hands, and walked toward the store dizzy and staggering. I couldn't believe I was still alive, even though I felt so weak and dizzy that I knew I would pass out at any moment. But still, in the middle of the mess the man had left, I managed to see my cell phone still placed next to the cash register, which was now open and with a pile of coins strewn about. I dialed 911, and with my last thread of consciousness, I told them as briefly as I could where I was and that my throat had been cut. That's the last thing I remember before everything went dark and I was completely unconscious. When I opened my eyes again, I was in a hospital bed, with a nurse injecting something into the hose attached to the back of my left hand. Immediately after she looked at me, she began to call the doctor. Immediately the memories of what happened began to hit me, and then I brought my hands to my neck and realized that I was bandaged. I honestly could not believe that I was alive. And I was very grateful for that, because surviving that was a possibility I never thought about. In fact, when I called 911, what was going through my mind was that I wanted them to find my body and inform my family of my death. I later learned that, probably because I was overweight, the knife did not penetrate deep enough to cut any major veins. And although it came very close, it never reached the jugular vein. And that was the only reason I was alive, because the man miscalculated where he made the cut. I have no words to describe how grateful I am to be alive, but without a doubt, this experience was enough to never work the night shift again, much less alone in the middle of nowhere. "10 years ago, I was working the night shift at a 24-hour restaurant. This job had its ups and downs. The pay was decent and the hours were long and quiet. The place had a steady stream of regular truckers and the occasional night owl craving a cup of coffee and a slice of pie to sweeten the night. I had been working there for about a year, and my shift started at 11 p.m. and continued until 7 a.m. I had been working there for about a year. This was a small restaurant. Most nights it was just Jaime, the cook, a gruff man in his 50s, and me, who was in charge of serving customers and taking their orders. One of our regular customers was a man named David. He was about 40 years old, stocky, bald with a thick beard, and had a habit of wearing the same brown leather jacket every time he came in. David was a somewhat reclusive guy. He usually sat at the counter and drank his coffee staring into the void, never caused any trouble, and came in a couple of times a week, always at the same time, between 2 and 3 a.m. He would order the same thing, sit in the same place, and after an hour or two, leave. David was one of those customers you get used to. However, about a month ago, something had changed. He started to come more frequently. It was no longer every 2 or 3 nights. He came every night and sat at the counter. But now, instead of looking into the void, he started to look at me. But it wasn't a casual look. It was more of an insistent look, a look that followed me everywhere, almost without blinking. At first, I ignored it. I was used to dealing with my share of lonely night shift customers who wanted to chat, and I assumed David had finally decided to join the club. At first, he was subtle, asking me how I was doing, if I was tired, if I ever got scared working alone at night. His questions were a bit personal, but I answered them politely, not wanting to be rude. But then he started leaving bigger tips, $10 to $20. One time he even left me $50, all for a cup of coffee and a slice of cake. Not that I was complaining, but my experience told me that that kind of generosity from a man is never selfless. One night, after I refilled his coffee, he came a little closer and said, "You're too pretty to work in a place like this at night. You never know who might come over." I laughed at the time, but I didn't really find his comment funny, and the way he said it made my skin crawl. I tried to avoid him after that, keeping my conversations short and to the point, but he kept coming back and his behavior got stranger. One night he came in with a small gift, a necklace. He handed it to me with a smile that made me uneasy. "I saw this and it reminded me of you," he said. I hesitated to accept it. I politely told him I couldn't receive it and thanked him for taking the trouble, but he insisted on placing it on the counter in front of me. I left it there, hoping he would retrieve it when he left, but he didn't. After he left, I threw it in the trash. A few nights later, things took a darker turn. One day around 3 a.m., the restaurant was empty except for David, who was sitting in his usual spot at the counter. Jaime was in the back taking a smoke break, and I was wiping down the counter trying to ignore the way David's eyes followed me everywhere. Suddenly, David broke the silence with a thought that crossed his mind. He commented on how easy it would be to subdue someone like me in a place like this. The mere suggestion scared me and sent a shiver down my back. My hand tightly clenched the rag I was using to clean, and David smiled, but there was nothing friendly in that smile. I understood exactly what he said. Being alone here most nights, I was vulnerable to anyone with bad intentions, and the thought of what could happen if someone decided to hurt me felt terribly real. I forced a laugh, trying to take it as a joke. He didn't respond. He just kept looking at me, and his smile never wavered. After what seemed like an eternity, he finished his coffee, left a large bill on the counter, and walked out without another word. I stood there for a long time after he left, staring at the door, my mind racing as I remembered his haunting words and the strange moment I had just had with this man. I knew I had to do something. I had to tell someone. Jaime, the police, someone. But I didn't want to make a big fuss out of nothing, so I decided not to let myself get paranoid and put the matter aside. The next night, David didn't show up at the restaurant for the first time in weeks. I felt a sense of relief so great I can't even describe it. I thought maybe he had finally gotten the message and decided to leave me alone. But just as I was closing the register, the phone rang. I picked it up, expecting it to be Jaime or a late-night order. But instead, there was only silence on the other end of the line. I was about to hang up when suddenly I heard a low, hoarse sigh, followed by David's voice. "Did you miss me?" he whispered into the phone. I hung up with a jolt and looked around the restaurant in panic, expecting to see him standing outside, but the parking lot was empty. I ran to the back, found Jaime, and told him what happened. He tried to calm me down, saying it was probably just a joke. The next night and the next were the same. There was no sign of David in the place, but the phone calls continued each time. It was the same silence, and then David's voice saying something creepy that gave me goosebumps. I knew I couldn't go on like this. My anxiety was through the roof. I could barely sleep. I was nervous all the time, and I began to dread my shifts at the restaurant. I told Jaime about the calls, but there wasn't much he could do. The police didn't take it seriously either, and said they couldn't do much without more concrete evidence than a phone call. I felt really desperate and very helpless, as it seemed that no one could do anything for me. Honestly, this man's attitude was starting to seriously worry me. One night, after several weeks of just calling, David came back to the restaurant. It was around 3 a.m. Just as before, I was wiping down the counter, trying not to think about the phone calls, when the door creaked open. I looked up, and there he was, standing in the doorway. I swear at that moment I just wanted to run and lock myself in the back room, but I didn't. I was frozen in the same spot. David walked up to the counter, sat down across from me, and asked me why I hadn't answered his calls. I instinctively stepped back, trying to create some space between us, but the distance offered little comfort, and told him to go away. He replied that he wasn't going anywhere until he got what he wanted. An answer that promised nothing but danger. I began to panic and looked back in hopes that Jaime would return, but the door remained closed, and I was alone. I tried to reach for the phone to call the police, but David moved faster, and his hand shot out, grabbing my wrist. I knew I had to get away from him, so with my free hand I grabbed the coffee pot off the counter, then planted it on his head with such force that he let go of my wrist and began to stagger. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I just ran out to the back room, screaming at the top of my lungs for help and calling for Jaime. When we both got back to the front, David was gone. The police took my report more seriously after that, especially when they saw the bruise on my wrist. They searched the area, but did not find David. They promised to keep an eye on the restaurant and my house, but I could no longer work there because the thought of going back and seeing David terrified me, so I quit the next day. I changed my phone number, moved to a new apartment, and tried to start over. But even though I was no longer working at the restaurant, I couldn't help but feel unsafe everywhere I went, so a few months later I went back to my hometown and stayed at my parents' house for a while. It was only from there that I started to feel safe again, and I was able to resume my life normally. I was 25 years old when this happened. This was not my first night shift job, but it was the only one where I worked completely alone, and it would also be the last such job I would ever take in my life. Now, before I share this story, let me tell you up front, I was not under the influence of any drugs, nor had I been drinking. Being completely honest, the reason I ended up living and working where I did was because I had just completed a detox and subsequent residential stay in a drug treatment program, so oddly enough, you could say I was as sober as possible. This was definitely not one of the best times of my life, but in the end, we live and learn from these moments anyway. Well, enough dizzying you with my background. The thing is, I worked the night shift as a maintenance man at a large retirement community located in the city of Temple, Texas, in late 2011. That day I arrived at 7 p.m. as I did every day. My checkout was at 6 a.m., and the seniors did not have to check out of what I will call the community building and return to their own individual apartments until 9 p.m. So there would be a window of about 2 hours in the community building to have a lot of older, friendly, chatty people milling around, playing cards, chatting, exercising, and that sort of thing. These people couldn't be warmer and more welcoming, it felt like, when I was a kid visiting my grandparents. But these were like 100 grandparents. So this 2-hour gap where these seniors were gathered there was my favorite part of the day. But then when the clock struck 9 p.m. sharp, there would be a drastic change in the energy of the place that I'll never forget. I noticed that, at each shift, as the clock approached 9 p.m., an uncomfortable sense of dread and anticipation would come over me. It was so heavy and palpable that I knew I would soon be isolated in that huge, silent building, all alone, or at least it would seem that way. In that way, I knew unconsciously that something was going on, but I always tried to ignore that feeling. In the building, there were windows that covered almost the entire structure, and they overlooked the outside parking lot. This building was arranged in a kind of U shape, or horseshoe shape, whatever you want to call it. The thing is that, due to its shape, from one hallway you could look across the parking lot and also see the other hallway, which constituted the other half of this U. I do not know if you understand, but the truth is that in that stretch I constantly used to see someone or something walking through the hallways. It was just strange at first. I kept thinking that surely it was just the blinds open in a certain way, or the shadow of the surrounding trees that gave the illusion of a human form. But this was just an attempt to lie to myself, because deep down, I knew that this was impossible. I encountered this figure practically every day. It was very strange because at first, whenever I saw him, it was as if he was walking in my direction, but from the other hallway, and sometimes he seemed to imitate my movements. That is, if I moved to one side, he did too. If I was walking and suddenly stopped, he did too. And when I tried to get closer to see who or what he was, he just disappeared. But I knew it wasn't a shadow of me. First, because of the distance I was at, and second, because there was no light, no beacon that could cast my shadow like that. Also, this kind of shadow moved at will, and when it imitated me, it was not an immediate movement but a delayed one, like when you were a child and your friend wanted to annoy you by playing this silly imitation game in which he repeated everything you did and said, something like that. I never succeeded in trying to figure it out or catch it. Most of the time I would see it and try to run over there, but it always slipped away and there was literally nowhere for anyone to hide or go, except forward or back down the hallway and past me. But I never found anyone, and that only served to heighten my suspicions that something very strange was going on inside this place. Not necessarily something evil or threatening, but it was there, and I knew I was there too. Since this was not really a commercial establishment, but rather a collection of community buildings. As I said before, we employees, both during the day and during the evenings, did not have a proper break room, so we all used the building's cafeteria space, as well as the refrigerator, microwave, and coffee maker that were there, which were actually meant to be used by the elderly when it came time to have breakfast, or their snacks throughout the day. I can't count the number of times I felt like having a quick pick-me-up coffee, or maybe a complimentary jello or snack or a slice of cake, and that night was no exception. As it was close to midnight, I was craving a hot cup of coffee as it was getting a bit chilly, so I headed for the coffee shop, and as I rounded the corner, before I got in the area, a nurse from the hospice wing was also rounding the corner from her side of the complex, scaring the hell out of me as I came face to face with her. Just imagine being about 5 or 6 hours into your shift, and you haven't seen or heard a single person's voice, or at least 3 or 4 hours, except for that ghostly figure you can never seem to really locate, and suddenly, boom, you run face to face with someone totally unexpected. I was just short of letting out a high-pitched squeal like a scared little girl at the time. The nurse must have thought I was a freak, since upon seeing her I almost had a heart attack. I apologized to her and tried to say something funny regarding the encounter. She smiled at me too, and then another nurse caught up with her. I made the coffee and served them both, and for the next 5 or 10 minutes we had a little friendly chat in the break area, or rather in the seniors' coffee bar that we used as a break area. These nurses kept coming in on several occasions during the night. This gave me the opportunity to at least have contact with other human beings during my night shift, which lowered my stress levels a bit. So, over the following weeks and months, I got used to expecting someone to be in that break area, at least once or twice during my long work shift. This helped me cope better with the overwhelming feeling of loneliness, as well as that other heavy, unsettling feeling that settled into the atmosphere once the seniors returned to their rooms and I was left alone on shift. However, that new feeling of companionship that allowed me to be able to let my guard down and not constantly be a walking nervous wreck came to an end one night when I was in what I called the cul-de-sac, which ironically was actually the side of the U, where the hallway ended in an office, a gym, and a physical therapy room, while, on the other side of the U, I had a door that led to more empty rooms and offices. I must say, that place had a special energy, as there you always felt as if something was behind you, watching you, stalking you. It was a very strong and very unsettling feeling. The worst part was having to slide a vacuum cleaner down there, because you constantly felt the need to turn around and check your back, as you couldn't rely on sounds to alert you. The thing is, one day I was cleaning the cul-de-sac, and other than that creepy feeling, everything was going pretty normal. But then something strange caught my attention. Through the window overlooking the back parking lot, there was a dimly lit sidewalk that bordered the building and led to a separate parking lot. This one was for employees only and was in the back. There, standing in the corner of that wall and almost trying to camouflage itself in the shadows, was a very tall, thin figure, half physical form, half parturition, and very demonic looking. This figure was about 8 feet tall, but when you looked down at its feet, it simply vanished. It was not a full or solid figure until around the upper thigh. Its torso was bare, revealing misshapen ribs and a bluish-white skin color, much like a corpse. Its arms were extremely long, as were its hands, whose fingers ended in what looked like pointed claws and did not appear to be 5 fingers but rather 3 or 4. I was completely paralyzed at the sight of him, bewildered, but also filled with terror. When I looked up into its face, I felt my heart freeze, for its face was that of a caravel, but not a human one, but like that of a goat, but with long locks of hair falling to the sides and its huge horns curled up. The creepiest thing, however, was that those empty sockets it had for eyes seemed to be staring straight at me. But it wasn't its hideous stature that terrified me the most. It was what I felt as its gaze drilled into me. The moment our gazes met, something happened that I still can't explain today, and that is, that the terror I felt was mixed with other feelings. Suddenly, an enormous feeling of emptiness and desolation began to invade me. I felt sad, desperate, and tormented. I felt an enormous desire to scream and cry, to get down on my knees. Images of my disastrous life began to flash through my head, filling me with anguish, despair, and sadness. My body was filled with overwhelming feelings: shame, pain, loss, despair. It was as if the most devastating feelings for a human being were crowding inside me at the same time, making me feel a torment that I had never experienced before in my life. And fortunately, not afterwards either. The experience was so intense that I felt nauseous, weak. My body was shaking, and before I knew it, I was crying my eyes out. At one point, I simply couldn't take it and looked away from him, or whatever it was that was standing there. I felt oppressed, suffocated, and fell to the floor on my knees, my hands on my chest, trying to breathe through all the emotional turmoil inside me at that moment. I swear I felt like I was going to die, so much so that I lay on the floor in a fetal position, hugging my legs to my chest, waiting for my heart to just stop beating at one point. And honestly, with all the horrible things I was feeling, it really did seem like death was a lucky thing. I lay there on the floor in that position for I don't know how long, but when I finally had the strength to stand up, I looked out the window again in terror. But the figure was no longer there. It was gone. And fortunately, that was the first and last time I got to see it. After that experience, I started cleaning the cul-de-sac when there were still people around. That is, before the old people returned to their apartments. If I had had another choice, maybe I would have moved and found another job, but I didn't have that option at the time, so I kept working every night feeling terrified of meeting that figure again. But there was something interesting about that entity, something I thought about in the days that followed, and that is that the place where I was standing was a palliative care area, a place where we lost at least one person every 2 weeks. Basically, that's where terminally ill patients spend their last days. This made me think about the feelings that overwhelmed me that night when I looked that figure in the eye, and the reason why I was standing right there. My theory about it is that that entity was indeed a demon. I don't know anything about demonic entities. Maybe if any of you have knowledge about that, you will know how to explain it better or understand what it was about. Or maybe you will know what kind of demon specifically it was, but I am sure it was. Personally, I believe that this entity fed on all the negative feelings that could overwhelm these people who saw their lives slipping through their fingers. All those feelings of loss, desolation, sadness, total hopelessness, homesickness, emptiness, and fear. I am sure that this was the reason why I was there, and also that this entity was responsible for that oppressive feeling that was felt all over the place when I was left alone. It was a couple more years before I was able to move and find another job, and during all that time, there was a latent fear inside me of meeting this being again. But as I said before, I had no other alternative. However, I tried as much as possible to relax by listening to music, talking to the nurses and the like, but it was not easy. I didn't tell anyone about it either, because I really didn't want to tell an old man who might eventually get his turn in palliative care that there was a demonic entity on the other side of the wall. That would be cruel. So instead, I kept this experience to myself for many years, until today when I am sharing it with you. My name is Linda, and I am 23 years old. A couple of years ago, I got a job at a 24-hour grocery store. I was in college and just wanted some money to cover my expenses and hang out with my friends. My study schedule was in the afternoon, so the evening hours were perfect for me. After a couple of months of working there, I started to get used to the regular customers. Most of them were nice or just average people. But there was also this one guy who was kind of weird and always gave me a bad feeling. He would arrive most nights between 11 and 12 p.m., and walk around the store for a long time before getting 1 or 2 cheap items and coming to the checkout. Whenever I arrived, I could always catch this man looking at me strangely on several occasions. He was a guy of about 40 or 45, small and thin. He had long hair and an unkempt beard. He also had a very particular way of walking, kind of penguin-like, and in general he was someone strange. He just didn't give me any confidence. He never talked much, but I had assumed he lived on the street or in his car, and that would explain why he only bought things like chips and snacks. Also the fact that his clothes were never clean and he looked unkempt everywhere. Several weeks, if not months, went by, and the man kept coming in almost daily and doing the exact same thing all the time. So at one point I stopped thinking about it, as it was now a very normal part of my job. But one night, he came in as usual. Only, instead of walking through the store, he went straight to the cash register. I asked him if he needed help with anything, and the man just looked at me for a second before asking me if I was the one driving the old Toyota that was in the parking lot. This seemed a little strange to me as he knew that, but then I thought it must be obvious as it was probably the only car that was there every day and in the same place. But, on the other hand, I found it somewhat disturbing that this person would notice it, as that would mean he was more aware of me than I thought. However, I tried to shake off my paranoid thoughts and just told him yes, because I thought maybe it was that there was something wrong with my car. But the man kept a straight face and walked away from the cash register without saying anything else. That was very strange, so I asked my co-worker to watch the registers for a moment, and then I went to the front of the store and looked outside. I went into the parking lot and my car was right where I had parked it, and there didn't seem to be anything wrong with it. I went back to the register, thinking I would ask the man about it when he came to pay, but he never did. I don't know when he left, but the store closed without him coming to the register like he always used to. That night when I left, I checked my whole car and nothing seemed out of place. It left me just confused. The next day I planned to ask him again, as I had actually been very intrigued by his question the night before, but the guy didn't come that day, or the next, or for the entire next month. The strange man seemed to have simply vanished, leaving me in doubt, but it wouldn't be long before I found out why he was so interested in knowing if the car was mine. One Monday at about 5 a.m., when it was still dark, I left work as usual. Sunday night was the only night of the week that I was alone at the register, so at the end of the day, I always left alone. But that early morning, when I started walking across the parking lot to my car, I had a really strange feeling in my gut. Maybe I just remembered it wrong, or maybe there really was some intuition about something. But I remember feeling that something was wrong from the moment I set foot outside the store, so I walked quickly and got into my car, looking around the parking lot nervously. It was practically empty and I had nothing to give me reason to believe anything was wrong, but somehow I knew something was out of place. I started my car, and just before I put it in gear, I heard the tiniest sound right behind me. I looked out of the corner of my eye and saw something move in the mirror in front of my back seat. At that moment, I felt a chasm open up in my stomach. I immediately panicked and left the car running as I ran out to the store, alerting my 2-day shift co-workers who had just arrived. We stood behind the store window and watched for a while to see if anyone got out of the car. Meanwhile, my partner called the police, but we didn't see anyone get out of the car during that whole time. When the officers arrived, my car was empty, and there was no sign of forced entry, so they assumed that the intruder must have had some illegal copy of a key, or I must have accidentally left the doors unlocked. The thought of this gave me chills. I didn't know which was worse, the fact that the intruder had a key to my car, or that he had been lurking around for days or weeks, waiting for the moment I accidentally left my car doors open to sneak in. I didn't actually get to see the intruder in my car, but I'm pretty sure it was the strange man from weeks ago, and that was the reason I wanted to know which car was mine. It terrifies me to think that maybe he had been trying to get in for the whole month that I hadn't seen him, and was waiting for me to forget to lock the doors, although I think I locked them that night, but I'm not sure. Maybe he forgot, or worse, maybe he managed to get a duplicate. Either way, it's something I'll probably never know for sure, but I can't rule it out completely. Whoever it was, though, the man who was there clearly wasn't simply trying to steal the car, as he even tried to stay hidden after I got in and started it. It's horrible to know that I was so close to having left that parking lot and driven off with him in the back seat, unknowingly, and once I would have gotten out of there, who knows what would have happened. Maybe he would have waited until I got into my house, or maybe he would have never made it home. It gives me chills just thinking about all the chances this person had that night to hurt me. After that incident, I really stopped feeling comfortable working at that place. The pay was good, and the work environment was good, but just the thought that creepy man could still be out there stalking me and waiting for the right moment to hurt me was just something I couldn't deal with, so less than a week later I put in my resignation and waited a couple of months before getting another night job. I have worked in a cemetery for the past 17 years. Most of those years I have been on the typical night shift, which was from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. In my mind, working at night had many more benefits than working during the day, since the daytime employees had more things to do. Since more people would visit the yard during the day, there would also be burials that would take place several times a week. which must be organized. And above all, during the whole process, the attendants must be in charge of preparing the grave, arranging the space where the relatives will be, and then taking care of doing the burial work. A job that is quite tiresome, to tell the truth. The night shift, on the other hand, gets paid an extra $2 an hour, and we don't have to do any of that. I must say that I have seen a lot during my years working the night shift at this place, mostly horrors more earthly than supernatural, from petty things like drunken teenagers daring each other to walk through the Campo Santo at night, to grave robbers trying to make off with corpses, or with the possible belongings their relatives may have buried them with. I have also seen practitioners of various dark cults trying to come to the cemetery to do witchcraft rituals and such things. However, what happened that night was completely different. I arrived at the small faculty building a little early to chat with the day worker, and once he left, I performed all the normal checks and precautions that protocol indicates at the start of my shift. After that, my only job is really to drive around in a golf cart from time to time around the holy field, making sure nothing unusual happens. I'd say I only run into something once a month, or maybe even every other month. Anyway, the first few hours were completely normal. I drove around a few times, then went back to the small faculty building for lunch, and I think it was around 2 a.m. when I went back out for another walk around the courtyard. When I got to the other end, I saw something by the fence. It was obviously very dark, so I couldn't see much more than the general shape of a figure standing there. I got as close as I could, and saw now that it was a man who was standing on the outside of the fence facing me. I didn't want to confront him if I didn't have to, so I turned around and entered a small loop around the lot to see if he would try to jump the fence while I was gone. But when I returned, after a few minutes, he was gone. I scanned the area briefly to make sure he didn't sneak in, but all seemed clear, so I continued my usual patrol. Going around the whole yard takes about 15 minutes, but sometimes I would go slower just to pass the time and make the day less boring. I was going the same way and decided to look again at the place where I saw the man. I really had nothing better to do anyway. I started driving there, and almost immediately I saw the man again. He was inside the yard on the gravel road. I approached again, but the man didn't move, so I got out of the golf cart and started walking towards him. He looked like a 40-year-old man. I stopped just a few feet away from him and said, "Sir, you can't be in here. I need to escort you out." But he didn't even turn his head to look at me. After a second, a slight wave of fear ran through me. After all, who was this man? And what was he doing in the cemetery at this time of night? It frightened me what a thief or a psychopath in full crisis could do, whichever way it went. I was alone and unarmed. Despite the unsettling feeling that was forming inside me, I insisted once again, "Sir, I need you to come with me." I reached out my hand gently to touch his shoulder, but as soon as I did, he whipped his head around and turned to look at me. This caught me off guard, and I took a step back. Then the man just stared into my eyes. He looked full of anger, and after a few seconds of us staring at each other in tense silence, the man turned and started walking away. "What the hell?" I said quietly. I went back to my golf cart, preparing to call the police as I watched him walk down to the fence, over it, and continue walking away. I was relieved, but still terrified. I drove straight back to the college and went inside. It was a small one-room security building, but I felt much safer and calmer in there. I sat down and caught my breath. In all my years working at the cemetery, I had never been so scared. I really had a very unsettling feeling. I waited inside for a while. I'm not sure how long, until I heard a knock on the door. I jumped out of my chair and looked towards the door in fear. A few seconds later, they knocked again. These were aggressive knocks, not those of someone friendly who wants to ask something or what do I know. No, these were furious and repeated knocks. It seemed that whoever was on the other side wanted to break down the door. I looked around in search of something to defend myself with. As I was trapped there, I had nowhere. But the only thing I had on hand was a thermos of coffee, so I took it to use as a weapon of defense in case it was necessary. Meanwhile, I took the phone from the desk and dialed 911. I didn't know what I wanted or why I was here, but I wasn't going to risk everything to find out. The person kept banging on the door. You could hear it was fists and kicks, but with impressive force. It was something furious, almost as if that person was venting a lot of anger against that door, as if he wanted to beat it down. But he wasn't saying anything. I mean, there was no yelling, no insults, no, "Open the door for me," nothing like that. Just frantic banging, and for no apparent reason. I felt really scared, and while I didn't know who was on the other side, I was absolutely sure it was the same guy I had encountered a moment ago, and God knows what he wanted. But after probably about 5 or 10 minutes of continuous banging, I heard footsteps walking away. They could be heard clearly, as there was gravel outside, and the footsteps were quite audible. Although I could no longer hear, and presumably he was gone, it wasn't until the police arrived that I opened the door. They searched the whole place but found no one, yet remained there for several hours to prevent the assailant from returning. The next day, my manager was able to pull up the building's CCTV security footage, and what I saw was truly horrible. Just a few minutes after I entered the building, the man I had seen in the courtyard earlier approached the door, stood there silently for almost 15 minutes before he started banging on the door almost madly. The man was pounding with his arms, legs, and head. He was completely enraged and crazed. As I watched these horrific images, I felt a shiver run through my entire body. I couldn't stop thinking about what could have happened to me if that man had managed to get into the building. These images were given as evidence to the police, but the man was never identified. From that day on, I requested permission to bring a weapon during my workday for safety. Fortunately, the company granted it. That was about 6 years ago, and to a job in the same cemetery. But I've never seen that guy again. I have been a registered nurse in a general hospital for about 3 years. It's one of the toughest jobs there is, although it's also rewarding, as my job is all about helping people at their most vulnerable times, when their health is failing. I work in the intensive care area, so most of my patients are people in serious condition, so most of the time I would be caring for the patient and administering medication, but from time to time I also provide support in the emergency area. We have had several people come in late at night complaining of fibromyalgia and other common conditions that could easily be treated at home. I often deal with these types of people in the emergency area by simply giving them simple over-the-counter medications, if they had insurance. However, there have been a few occasions when we have had to treat patients who really needed it, and in these cases, if the person is too insistent, sometimes placebos can be given. The thing is that treating patients not only makes you feel rewarded, but sometimes you also develop a bond with them, and this story has the same principle. Once I took care of an old man whose wife had just died, and he was admitted to the hospital for a severe bacterial infection. His name was Joaquin, and he was the sweetest and gentlest grandfather ever. Taking care of Joaquin, more than an obligation, for me it was a pleasure. He generated a tenderness that I could not even explain. He was also very nice, cheerful, and always told us his life stories, and he really had a very interesting life. He also often talked about his deceased wife, how he met her and how much he loved her. When I had to take care of Joaquin, the hours flew by. I really began to develop an emotional connection with him. He was also a great dog lover. He had 3 dogs at home, and every day he would show some concern for them and say he missed them so much and couldn't wait to get out of the hospital to go see them. This broke my heart a little bit, because Joaquin's condition was quite delicate, and the hospital did not allow pets, so he would probably never see his dogs again. As a nurse, it is our responsibility to be there to be patient and give emotional support to the patient if required, although this is something that not many nurses do, but I do. After all, someday I will be on the other side, on the patient's side, and I would like to receive from my nurse the same dignified and humane treatment that I try to give to my patients. One day Joaquin looked at me almost in tears and thanked me for everything I had done for him. This surprised me completely and left me with a great tightness in my chest, as I soon realized what those words meant. Joaquin passed away a day later, and I cried for almost a week. The other nurses were sad, but not as sad as I was, as he was one of the people I really cared about, and when he was gone, I felt the grief as if I had lost someone very close. Weeks went by and I just got over it. It often popped into my head from time to time, but I moved on, as this was something I had to get used to. One night I was talking to one of my colleagues at the reception desk about a patient's medical history when she asked me to get a piece of equipment out of the basement. The basement of the hospital is where we usually keep our equipment and other medical supplies for storage. They are not common in most hospitals, but they do exist. It is very rare for one of us to go down to the basement, so this meant we needed something quite important. I took the elevator and pressed the basement level. As I turned on the lights, I had this somewhat creepy feeling. I've been in the basement many times and I've never had a feeling like this. To best describe it, it felt like a feeling of dread coming from somewhere here, but I wasn't sure where, to be fair. Basements are creepy in and of themselves, especially hospital basements, but this was the first time I experienced that in this place. I was walking down this little hallway we have, and I grabbed the equipment that was sitting on one of the shelves, and at that moment, I could have sworn I heard footsteps behind me. However, they didn't sound like the footsteps of someone wearing shoes. They sounded like the footsteps of a barefoot person walking on the tile. For a moment, I assumed it was one of my classmates, trying to play a joke on me. This would not be unusual. We always played this kind of pranks on each other, so I thought I would catch them in the act and surprise them, or whoever it was. But the surprise was mine. I left the room and went back to the main area, but saw no one. At some point, I shouted, "Hello to everyone here. Don't strain yourselves, guys, I saw you." I hadn't seen anyone, but that would bring down their little joke. However, I didn't get a response. I needed to leave quickly, so I didn't give them any thought and headed for the elevator. But at that moment I heard loud and clear an old man's voice call my name. The voice echoed throughout the hallway, and yes, it was Joaquin's voice. I stood frozen in place, my ears wide open, waiting to hear the voice again. And I didn't have to wait long. A few seconds later, I heard Joaquin's voice calling my name again, now behind me. Fighting the stiffness in my muscles and the panic that was taking over my being, I turned around to see who was behind me, and to my surprise, there was no one, just the empty hallway. I was now officially scared. I clutched the equipment in my arms and ran out down the hallway until I reached the elevator. I immediately pressed the second floor, which was the area where I was to take the equipment, and after handing it to my friend, I drank a glass of hot coffee almost as if it was a shot. I was visibly upset, so my partner asked me what was wrong with me, but I really didn't want to tell her what had just happened because she probably wouldn't believe me or would think I was making up stories. But I didn't make up anything. That was completely real. Since that day, I have never gone down to the basement alone again, and I never heard Joaquin again either. However, I kept him in my prayers for many days, so that God would help him find his way to where he belongs now. During all these years I have been a nurse, I have seen and experienced many things, but this was undoubtedly the most frightening of all.